A collection of rare and curious tracts on witchcraft and the second sight. By unknown author. An original essay on witchcraft. If we wish to form a just estimate of the human character in its progress through the various stages of civilization, from ignorance and barbarism, to science and refinement, we must search into the natural causes that actuate the human mind. The life of man is prolonged to a remoter period, but subjected to more casualties, and greater vicissitudes of fortune, than most other animals. From these causes arises his anxious solicitude about futurity, and an eager desire to know his destiny, and thus man becomes the most superstitious of all other creatures. In every nation there have been multitudes of oracles, augurs, soothsayers, diviners, fortune-tellers, witches, sorcerers, and whose business has been to communicate intelligence respecting futurity, to the rest of mankind. If we attend to history, we shall find this theory sufficiently confirmed by experience. The most superstitious part of the species are soldiers and sailors, who are more exposed to accidents than any other class. History is full of the superstitious observances of the Roman armies, their regard to omens, the entrails of victims, the flight of birds, and there are thousands of brave sailors of the present day, who would not sail in the finest ship of the British Navy, without a horseshoe were nailed on the mainmast. This passion of diving into futurity, naturally produced a number of dealers in destiny's dark counsel, who soon found it turn out a very lucrative profession. From knowing the secrets, it was naturally inferred, that they were the favorites of those powers who are supposed to have the future happiness of mankind at their disposal. This we apprehend is the real source of that power which the priesthood hath ever exercised over the human mind. Pleasure and pain are the two great principles of human action which has given rise to the good and evil principle common to all nations. Those who held communication and commerce with the evil principle, are witches, wizards, sorcerers, and although we have various laws and injunctions against witchcraft in Scripture, yet we are still as much in the dark as ever, as no definition is given of it, nor is the particular actions which constitute witchcraft enumerated, so as we can say wherein it consists. The story of the Witch of Endor is a case that throws more light on the subject than any other. But she appears to have acted more in the character of one of our second-sighted seers, than one of our modern witches. According to our notions and ideas of witchcraft, as laid down by that sapient monarch James VI, it is a poor ignorant old woman, who, through misery or malice, gives herself to the devil, soul and body, and renounces her baptism. For which consideration Satan engages to assist her with his power to work a number of petty mischiefs on such as she has a spite at. And sometimes he advances a little of the needful, which, unfortunately for the poor old hag, turns out to be nothing but sclate stains, and this most unaccountable contract is generally sealed by carnal copulation. And yet, after believing this, we call ourselves rational creatures, and other animals we term brutes. Many people have wondered, how so exalted a personage as the devil formerly was in days of yore, should latterly have taken up with such low company as our modern witches. He who tempted the very fathers of the Church in so many various ways. Who kept the whole priesthood of the Catholic Church constantly on the alert with holy water, exorcisms, and only to keep him in check, who often attacked Luther and our other reformers, in very ungentlemanly disguises. And had even the audacity to insult our covenanted saints, by bellowing like a bull, grunting like a pig, or groaning like a dying man. These were pranks something worthier of a devil than the tricks played off by the witches. Our King James gives the reason, because the consummation of the world, and our deliverance drawing near, makes Satan so rage the more in his instruments, knowing his kingdom to be so near an end. James was a little out in his reckoning here, the consummation of the world not having taken place as yet, and the devil's kingdom turning out to be rather better established than his own. So far was it from being near an end, that it was on the increase, caused chiefly by the absurd and stupid laws that were enacted against it by himself and successors. The devil's kingdom is not to be destroyed by acts of parliament and burning of witches. These expedients have been tried in vain all over Europe and America, without effect. But now, when every person can bewitch with impunity, not a witch is to be found, and the devil, though left at large, has retreated to the highlands and islands, where he is seldom seen, even by those who have the second sight. The true engines for battering the strongholds of Satan, and driving him and his imps into utter darkness, are science and philosophy. These are the weapons that have compelled him to retrograde movements, after lavishing rivers of holy water in vain. Thus the terrific claws of the devil, when seen by the distempered eyes of ignorant bigotry, appear to us truly horrible, but when viewed through philosophical spectacles, look as harmless as the lambskin gloves of a fine lady. These stories, however, convey a strong likeness of the times in which they were acted. In our day, it is almost impossible to believe that human beings could give credit to such gross absurdities as we have laid before the public in this little work, were the evidence not indubitable. Far less, that judges, lawyers, and divines, should unite in murdering such numbers of poor ignorant helpless creatures, for such mad chimeras, when it is hard to say, whether the poor victim, or the insane judges, were under the greater delusion. These wonderful tales of the doings of the devil with the witches, are taken from their own confessions, and from their delating of one another, as it is called. To us it does not appear improbable, but that too many of the poor deluded wretches actually imagined themselves to be witches. Nor will this appear so very surprising, if we consider the circumstances of the case. At that period, any person who doubted of witchcraft, was looked upon as an atheist, and worse than mad. The whole country, from one end to the other, was continually ringing with tales of witches, devils, and fairies, with such other trash. Is it not then most likely, that people should dream about them? And is there anything unnatural in supposing, that they should mistake these dreams for realities? As is evidently proved in several cases, and then confess, not the actions they really did, but the effects of their own disordered imagination. Moreover, when confined for this imaginary crime, they were tortured in all manner of ways, deprived of sleep, flung into water, and brought it, as they called it, being striped naked and searched for the devil's mark, in the most indecent manner. These confessions, after they were made, were nothing more than the wild ravings of a distempered imagination, and such a tissue of inconsistencies, as no person of the present day would listen to. An old woman in the Isle of Terry, as related by Mr. Fraser, page 165, took in her head that she was in heaven no less, and had eat and drank there. And so firmly had the poor creature imbibed the notion, that it was with some difficulty she could be undeceived. A curious account of a pretended meeting with the devil, is given by a gentleman of Normandy, in the Memoirs of Literature for November 1711. The pretended meeting, about which those who believe they have been at it, relate so many extravagant things, is only in their imagination. I own, that some country people, especially shepherds, do now and then rub their skin with some narcotic grease or ointments, which cast them into a sound sleep, and fill their imagination with 1,000 visions. When they are thus asleep, they fancy they see everything that was told them concerning the devil's meeting, by their fathers, who were also shepherds, or wizards, if you will have me to call them so. Whereupon I will inform you of what I have been told by a country friend of mine, who pretended to have a mind to go to the devil's meeting with his own shepherd, who had the reputation of being a great sorcerer. Having frequently urged that shepherd to carry him thither, at last he obtained his desire. He went to him in the night at the appointed time. The shepherd immediately gave him something to grease himself withal. He took the grease as if he had a mind to rub his skin with it, but he desired that the shepherd's son, who was to go to the devil's meeting with his father, should anoint himself first. Which being done, that gentleman told the shepherd, that he should be glad to know what would become of the young man. Not long after, the young man fell fast asleep, and when he awaked, though he had not stirred from that place, he gave an account of everything he thought he had seen at the devil's meeting. And even named several persons whom he pretended to have seen there. My friend perceived then, that what is commonly said of the devil's meeting was a mere fancy. I have told you this story, that you may impart it to your brethren, who being prepossessed with popular errors about witchcraft, do frequently hang and burn poor wretches, whose crime does only consist in the weakness of their imagination. 1,000 more instances might be produced to show, that the devil hath no meetings anywhere, but in the perturbed brain of ignorant credulity. The history of superstition is however of great use. We there see its dangerous influence upon the peace and happiness of society, its degrading effects upon the character and manners of nations, in morality, literature, jurisprudence, and science. Theology seems to have been particularly infected with this pestiferous contagion. The clergy were generally in the front rank of witch hunters, and through their influence, the most of them were put to death. In places where the minister was inflamed with a holy zeal against the devil and his emissaries, such as Pittenweem and Torryburn, the parish became a perfect hotbed for the rearing of witches. And so plentiful a crop did it produce, that it appeared nothing else could thrive. But in places where the minister had some portion of humanity, and a little common sense, the devil very rarely set foot on his territories, and witchcraft was not to be found. Since the repeal of the statutes against witchcraft, several prosecutions have been instituted against witches, who were convicted and punished. But it was bewitching silly ignorant people out of their money, goods, and common sense, by pretending a knowledge of futurity, a power of relieving maladies in man or beast, or procuring the affection of some favorite swain to a love-sick maiden. The dupes of these impostors do not altogether escape, as they are made the laughing stock of their neighbors, and by these means even this trade is now nearly annihilated. Happily for our times, the refulgent brightness of philosophy and science, hath dispelled these dark clouds of benighted superstition, and left us in possession only of our natural powers and faculties, which are quite enough. Editor. News from Scotland. Declaring the damnable life of Dr. Fin. A notable sorcerer, who was burned at Edinburgh in January last, 1591. Which doctor was registered to the devil that sundry times preached at North Berwick Kirk to a number of notorious witches. With the true examinations of the said doctor and witches, as they uttered them in the presence of the Scottish king. Discovering how they pretended to bewitch and drown his majesty in the sea coming from Denmark. With such other wonderful matters as the like hath not been heard at any time. Published according to the Scottish copy. Printed for William Wright. Edinburgh, reprinted for D. Webster, 35, West College Street. 1820. To the reader. The manifold untruths which are spread abroad concerning the detestable actions and apprehension of those witches whereof this history following truly entreateth, hath caused me to publish the same in print. And the rather for that sundry written copies are lately dispersed thereof, containing that the said witches were first discovered by means of a poor pedlar travelling to the town of Trenant. And that by a wonderful manner he was in a moment conveyed at midnight from Scotland to Bordeaux in France, being places of no small distance, into a merchant's cellar there. And after being sent from Bordeaux into Scotland by certain Scottish merchants to the King's Majesty, that he discovered those witches, and was the cause of their apprehension. With a number of matters miraculous and incredible, all which in truth are most false. Nevertheless, to satisfy a number of honest Mindies, who are desirous to be informed of the verity and truth of their confessions, which for certain tie is more stranger than the common repo root runneth, and yet with more truth. I have undertaken to publish this short treatise which declareth the true discourse of all that happened, and as well what was pretended by those wicked and detestable witches against the King's Majesty, as also by what means they wrought the same. All which examinations, gentle reader, I have here truly published as they were taken and uttered in the presence of the King's Majesty, praying thee to accept of it for verity, the same being so true as cannot be reproved. A true discourse of the apprehension of sundry witches lately taken in Scotland, whereof some are executed, and some are yet imprisoned. With a particular recital of their examinations, taken in the presence of the King's Majesty. God, by his omnipotent power, hath at all times, and daily doth take such care, and is so vigilant for the weal and preservation of his own, that thereby he disappointeth the wicked practices and evil intents of all such as by any means whatsoever seek indirectly to conspire anything contrary to his holy will, yea. And by the same power he hath lately overthrown and hindered the intentions and wicked dealings of a great number of ungodly creatures, no better than devils. who suffering themselves to be allured and enticed by the devil whom they served, and unto whom they were privately sworn, entered into the detestable art of witchcraft, which they studied and practiced so long time, that in the end they had seduced by their sorcery a number of others to be as bad as themselves, dwelling in the bounds of Lothian, which is a principal shire or part of Scotland, where the King's Majesty useth to make his chiefest residence or abode. And to the end that their detestable wickedness which they privily had pretended against the King's Majesty, the commonweal of that country, with the nobility and subjects of the same, should come to light. God of his unspeakable goodness did reveal and lie it open in very strange sort, thereby to make known to the world that their actions were contrary to the law of God and the natural affection which we ought generally to bear one to another. The manner of the revealing whereof was as followeth. Within the town of Trennant, in the kingdom of Scotland, there dwelleth one David Seaton, who being deputy bailiff in the said town, had a maid called Gales Duncaine, who used secretly to absent and lie forth of her maister's house every other night. This Gales Duncaine took in hand to help all such as were troubled or grieved with any kind of sickness or infirmity, and in short space did perform many matters most miraculous. Which things, forasmuch as she began to do them upon a so dame, having never done the like before, made her maester and others to be in great admiration, and wondered thereat, by means whereof the said David Seaton had his maid in great suspicion that she did not those things by natural and lawful ways, but rather supposed it to be done by some extraordinary and unlawful means. Whereupon her maester began to grow very inquisitive, and examined her which way and by what means she was able to perform matters of so great importance. Whereat she gave him no answer, nevertheless, her maester to the intent that he might the better try and find out the truth of the same, did with the help of others torment her with the torture of the pillowinks upon her fingers, which is a grievous torture, and binding or wrenching her head with a cord or rope, which is a most cruel torment also, yet would she not confess anything. Whereupon they suspecting that she had been marked by the devil, as commonly witches are, made diligent search about her, and found the enemy's mark to be in her fore crag, or fore part of her throat. Which being found, she confessed that all her doings was done by the wicked allurements and enticements of the devil, and that she did them by witchcraft. After this her confession, she was committed to prison, where she continued a season, where immediately she accused these persons following to be notorious witches, and caused them forthwith to be apprehended, one after another, viz. Agnes Sampson, the eldest witch of them all, dwelling in Haddington, Agnes Thompson of Edenbrough. Dr. Fian, alias John Cunningham, master of the Scool at Saltpans in Lothian, of whose life and strange acts you shall hear more largely in the end of this discourse. These were by the said Gales Duncaine accused, as also George Mott's wife, dwelling in Lothian, Robert Grierson, skipper, and Janet Blandelands, with the potter's wife of Seaton. The smith at the brig Halley's, with innumerable others in those parts, and dwelling in those bounds aforesaid, of whom some are already executed. The rest remain in prison to receive the doom of judgment at the King's Majesty's will and pleasure. The said Gales Duncaine also caused Euphaim McElrean to be apprehended, who conspired and performed the death of her godfather, and who used her art upon a gentleman, being one of the lords and justices of the session, for bearing goodwill to her daughter. She also caused to be apprehended one Barbara Napier, for bewitching to death Archibald la Earl of Angus, who languished to death by witchcraft, and yet the same was not suspected. But that he died of so strange a disease as the physician knew not how to cure or remedy the same. But of all other the said witches, these two last before recited, were reputed for as civil honest women as any that dwelled within the city of Edenbrough, before they were apprehended. Many other besides were taken dwelling in Leith, who are detained in prison until his Majesty's further will and pleasure be known, of whose wicked doings you shall particularly hear, which was as followeth. This aforesaid Agnes Sampson, which was the elder witch, was taken and brought to Haliburtoun House before the King's Majesty, and sundry other of the nobility of Scotland, where she was straitly examined. But all the persuasions which the King's Majesty used to her, with the rest of his council, might not provoke or induce her to confess anything, but stood stiffly in the denial of all that was laid to her charge. Whereupon they caused her to be conveyed away unto prison, there to receive such torture as hath been lately provided for witches in that country. And for as much as by due examination of witchcraft and witches in Scotland, it hath lately been found that the devil doth generally mark them with a privy mark, by reason the witches have confessed themselves. That the devil doth lick them with his tongue in some privy part of their body, before he doth receive them to be his servants, which mark commonly is given them under the hair in some part of their body. Whereby it may not easily be found out or seen, although they be searched. And generally so long as the mark is not seen to those which search them, so long the parties which have the mark will never confess anything. Therefore by special commandment this Agnes Sampson had all her hair shaven off, and each part of her body, and her head thrawn with a rope according to the custom of that country, being a pain most grievous. Which they continued almost an hour, during which time she would not confess anything until the devil's mark was found upon her privities, then she immediately confessed whatsoever was demanded of her. And justifying those persons aforesaid to be notorious witches. Item, the said Agnes Sampson was after brought again before the King's Majesty in his council, and being examined of the meeting and detestable dealings of those witches, she confessed, that upon the night of Allhallow even last, she was accompanied as well with the persons aforesaid, as also with a great many other witches, to the number of 200, and that all they together went to sea, each one in a riddle or sieve, and went into the same very substantially, with flagons of wine, making merry and drinking by the way in the same riddles or sieves, to the kirk of North Berwick in Lothian, and that after they had landed, took hands on the land and danced this rail or short dance, singing all with one voice. Comer go ye before, comer go ye. Jif ye will not go before, comer let me. At which time she confessed, that this Gailey's Duncan did go before them playing this rail or dance, upon a small trump, called a Jew's trump, until they entreed into the kirk of North Berwick. These confessions made the king in a wonderful admiration, and sent for the said Gailey Duncan, who upon the like trump did play the said dance before the King's Majesty, who in respect of the strangeness of these matters, took great delight to be present at their examinations. Item, the said Agnes Sampson confessed, that the devil, being then at North Berwick Kirk attending their coming, in the habit or likeness of a man, and seeing that they tarried over long, he at their coming enjoined them all to a penance. Which was, that they should kiss his buttocks, in sign of duty to him. Which being put over the pulpit bare, every one did as he had enjoined them, and having made his ungodly exhortations, wherein he did greatly inveigh against the King of Scotland, he received their oaths for their good and true service towards him, and departed. Which done, they returned to sea, and so home again. At which time the witches demanded of the devil why he did bear such hatred to the king. Who answered, by reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the world. One all which their confessions and depositions are still extant upon record. Item, the said Agnes Sampson confessed before the King's Majesty sundry things, which were so miraculous and strange, as that his Majesty said they were all extreme liars. Whereat she answered, she would not wish his Majesty to suppose her words to be false, but rather to believe them, in that she would discover such matters unto him as his Majesty should not any way doubt of. And thereupon taking his Majesty a little aside, she declared unto him the very words which passed between the King's Majesty and his Queen at Upslo in Norway the first night of marriage, with the answer eke to other. Whereat the King's Majesty wondered greatly, and swore by the living God, that he believed all the devils in hell could not have discovered the same, acknowledging her words to be most true. And therefore gave the more credit to the rest that is before declared. Touching this Agnes Sampson, she is the only woman who by the devil's persuasion should have intended and put in execution the King's Majesty's death in this manner. She confessed that she took a black toad, and did hang the same up by the heels 3 days, and collected and gathered the venom it dropped and fell from it in an oyster shell, and kept the same venom close covered, until she should obtain any part or piece of foulé linen cloth that had appertained to the King's Majesty, as shirt, handkercher, napkin, or any other thing, which she practised to obtain by means of one John Kerrs, who being attendant in his Majesty's chamber, desired him for old acquaintance between them, to help her to one or a piece of such a cloth as is aforesaid, which thing the said John Kers denied to help her to, saying he could not help her unto it. And the said Agnes Sampson by her deposition since her apprehension, saith, that if she had obtained any one piece of linen cloth which the kinge had worn and fouled, she had bewitched him to death, and put him to such extraordinary pains, as if he had been lying upon sharp thorns and endies of needles. Moreover she confessed, that at the time when his Majesty was in Denmark, she being accompanied by the parties before specially named, took a cat and christened it, and afterward bound to each part of that cat the chiefest part of a dead man, and several joints of his body. And that in the night following, the said cat was conveyed into the midst of the sea by all the witches, sailing in their riddles or sieves, as is aforesaid, and so left the said cat right before the town of Leith in Scotland. This doon, there did arise such a tempest in the sea, as a greater hath not been seen. Which tempest was the cause of the perishing of a boat or vessel coming over from the town of Brunt Island to the town of Leith, wherein was sundry jewels and rich gifts, which should have been presented to the now Queen of Scotland at her Majesty's coming to Leith. Again it is confessed, that the said christened cat was the cause that the King's Majesty's ship at his coming forth of Denmark had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships then being in his company. Which thing was most strange and true as the King's Majesty acknowledgeth, for when the rest of the ships had a fair and good wind, then was the wind contrary and altogether against his Majesty. And further, the said witche declared, that his Majesty had never come safely from the sea, if his faith had not prevailed above their intentions. 2. Moreover, the said witches being demanded how the devil would use them when he was in their company, they confessed, that when the devil did receive theme for his servant, and that they had vowed themselves unto him, then he would carnally use them, albeit to their little pleasure, in respect to his cold nature. 3. And would do the like at sundry other times. As touching the aforesaid Dr. Fian, alias John Cunningham, the examination of his acts since his apprehension, declareth the great subtlety of the devil, and therefore mocketh things to appear the more miraculous. For being apprehended by the accusation of the said Gales Duncan aforesaid, who confessed he was their register, and that there was not one man suffered to come to the devil's readings but only he, the said doctor was taken and imprisoned, and used with the accustomed pain provided for those offences, inflicted upon the rest as is aforesaid. First, by throwing of his head with a rope, whereat he would confess nothing. Secondly, he was persuaded by fair means to confess his follies, but that would prevail as little. Lastly, he was put to the most severe and cruel pain in the world, called the Boades, who, after he had received 3 strokes, being inquired if he would confess his damnable acts and wicked life, his tongue would not serve him to speak. In respect whereof the rest of the witches willed to search his tongue, under which was found 2 pins thirst up into the head. Whereupon the witches did say, now is the charm stinted, and shewed, that those charmed pins were the cause he could not confess anything. Then was he immediately released of the Boades, brought before the king, his confession was taken, and his own hand willingly set thereunto, which contained as followeth. First, that at the general meetings of those witches, he was always present, that he was clerk to all those that were in subjection to the devil's service, bearing the name of witches, that always he did take their oaths for their true service to the devil, and that he wrote for them such matters as the devil still pleased to command him. Item, he confessed that by his witchcraft he did bewitch a gentleman dwelling near to the saltpans, where the said doctor kept skoal, only for being enamoured of a gentlewoman whom he loved himself. By means of which his sorcery, witchcraft, and devilish practices, he caused the said gentleman that once in 18 hours he fell into a lunacy and madness, and so continued 1 whole hour together. And for the verity of the same, he caused the gentleman to be brought before the King's Majesty, which was upon the 18th day of December last, and being in his Majesty's chamber, suddenly he gave a great scritch, and fell into madness, sometime bending himself, and sometime capering so directly up, that his head did touch the ceiling of the chamber, to the great admiration of his Majesty and others then present. So that all the gentlemen in the chamber were not able to hold him, until they called in more help, who together bound him hand and foot. And suffering the said gentleman to lie still until his fury were past, he within an hour came again to himself, when being demanded by the king's majesty what he saw or did all that while, answered, that he had been in a sound sleep. Item, the said doctor did also confess, that he had used means sundry times to obtain his purpose and wicked intent of the same gentlewoman, and seeing himself disappointed of his intention, he determined by all ways he might to obtain the same, trusting by conjuring, witchcraft, and sorcery, to obtain it in this manner. It happened this gentlewoman being unmarried, had a brother who went to school with the said doctor, and calling the said scholar to him, demanded if he did lie with his sister, who answered he did. By means whereof he thought to obtain his purpose, and therefore secretly promised to teach him without stripes, so he would obtain for him 3 hairs of his sister's privities, at such time as he should spy best occasion for it. Which the youth promised faithfully to perform, and vowed speedily to put it in practice, taking a piece of conjured paper of his maester to lap them in when he had gotten them. And thereupon the boy practised nightly to obtain his maester's purpose, especially when his sister was asleep. But God, who knoweth the secret of all hearts, and revealeth all wicked and ungodly practices, would not suffer the intents of this devilish doctor to come to that purpose which he supposed it would. And therefore to declare that he was heavily offended with his wicked intent, did so work by the gentlewoman's own means, that in the end the same was discovered and brought to light. For she being one night asleep, and her brother in bed with her, so dainly cried out to her mother, declaring that her brother would not suffer her to sleep. Whereupon, her mother having a quick capacity, did vehemently suspect Dr. Fien's intention, by reason she was a witch of herself, and therefore presently arose, and was very inquisitive of the boy to understand his intent. And the better to know the same, did beat him with sundry stripes, whereby he discovered the truth unto her. The mother, therefore, being well practised in witchcraft, did think it most convenient to meet with the doctor in his own arte, and thereupon took the paper from the boy wherein he would have put the same hairs. And went to a young heifer which never had borne calf, nor gone unto the bull, and with a pair of shears clipped off 3 hairs from the udder of the cow, and wrapped them in the same paper, which she again delivered to the boy. Then willing him to give the same to his said maester, which he immediately did. The schoolmaster, so soon as he did receive them, thinking them indeed to be the maid's hairs, went straight and wrought his arte upon them, but the doctor had no sooner done his intent to them, but presently the heifer cow, whose hairs they were indeed, came unto the door of the church wherein the schoolmaster was, into the which the heifer went, and made towards the schoolmaster, leaping and dancing upon him, and following him forth of the church. And to what place soever he went, to the great admiration of all the townsmen of Saltpans, and many others who did behold the same. The report whereof made all men imagine that he did work it by the divil, without whom it could never have been so sufficiently effected. And thereupon the name of the said Dr. Fien, who was but a young man, began to grow common among the people of Scotland, that he was secretly nominated for a notable conjurer. All which, although in the beginning he denied, and would not confess, yet having felt the pain of the boadies for, and the charm stinted as aforesaid, he confessed all the aforesaid to be most true, without producing any witnesses to justify the same. And thereupon before the king's majesty he subscribed the said confession with his own hand, which for truth remaineth upon record in Scotland. After that the depositions and examinations of the said Dr. Fien, alias Cunningham, was taken, as already is declared, with his own hand willingly set thereunto, he was by the maester of the prison committed to ward, and appointed to a chamber by himself, where forsaking his wicked ways, acknowledging his most ungodly life, shewing that he had too much followed the allurements and enticements of Sathan, and fondly practised his conclusions by conjuring, witchcraft, enchantment, sorcery, and such like, he renounced the divil and all his wicked works, vowed to lead the life of a Christian, and seemed newly converted towards God. The morrow after, upon conference had with him, he granted that the divil had appeared unto him in the night before, apparelled all in black, with a white wanda in his hand. And that the divil demanded of him if he would continue his faithful service, according to his first oath and promise made to that effect. Whom, as he then said, he utterly renounced to his face, and said unto him in this manner, Avoid, Satan, avoid, for I have listened too much unto thee, and by the same thou hast undone me. In respect whereof I utterly forsake thee, to whom the devil answered, that once ere thou die thou shalt be mine. And with that, as he said, the devil brake the white wanda, and immediately vanished forth of his sight. Thus all the day this Dr. Fian continued very solitary, and seemed to have a care of his own soul, and would call upon God, shewing himself penitent for his wicked life. Nevertheless, the same night he found such means that he stole the key of the prison door and chamber in which he was, which in the night he opened and fled away to the saltpans, where he was always resident, and first apprehended. Of whose sodanne departure when the King's Majesty had intelligence, he presently caused diligent inquiry to be made for his apprehension. And for the better effecting thereof, he sent public proclamations into all parts of his land to the same effect. By means of whose hot and hard pursuit he was again taken and brought to prison. And then being called before the King's Highness, he was re-examined as well touching his departure, as also touching all that had before happened. But this doctor, notwithstanding that his own confession appeareth remaining in record under his own hand writing, and the same thereunto fixed in the presence of the King's Majesty and sundry of his council, yet did he utterly deny the same. Thereupon the King's Majesty perceiving his stub-born wilfulness, conceived and imagined that in the time of his absence he had entered into new conference and league with the devil his master. And that he had been again newly marked, for the which he was narrowly searched, but it could not in any way be found. Yet for more trial of him to make him confess, he was commanded to have a most strange torment, which was done in this manner following. His nails upon all his fingers were riven and pulled off with an instrument called in Scottish aticas, which in England we call a pair of pincers, and under every nail there was thrust in through needles over even up to the heads. At all which torments notwithstanding the doctor never shrunk any whit, neither would he then confess it the sooner for all the tortures inflicted upon him. Then was he with all convenient speed, by commandment, conveyed again to the torment of the Boades, wherein he continued a long time, and did abide so many blows in them, that his legs were crushed and beaten together as small as might be. And the bones and flesh so bruised, that the blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance, whereby they were made unserviceable for ever. And notwithstanding all these grievous pains and cruel torments he would not confess anything, so deeply had the devil entered into his heart, that he utterly denied that which he before avouched, and would say nothing thereunto but this: that what he had done and said before, was only done and said for fear of pains which he had endured. Upon great consideration, therefore, taken by the King's Majesty in his council, as well for the due execution of justice upon such detestable malefactors, as also for example's sake, to remain a terror to all others hereafter that shall attempt to deal in the like wicked and ungodly actions, as witchcraft, sorcery, conjuration, and such like, the said Dr. Fian was soon after arraigned, condemned, and adjudged by the law to die, and then to be burned according to the law of that land provided in that behalf. Whereupon he was put into a cart, and being first strangled, he was immediately put into a great fire, being ready provided for that purpose, and there burned in the Castile Hill of Edinburgh, on a Saturday in the end of January last past. 1591. The rest of the witches which are not yet executed, remain in prison till farther trial and knowledge of his Majesty's pleasure. This strange discourse before recited, may perhaps give some occasion of doubt to such as shall happen to read the same, and thereby conjecture that the King's Majesty would hazard himself in the presence of such notorious witches, lest thereby might have ensued great danger to his person and the general state of the land, which thing in truth might well have been feared. But to answer generally to such let this suffice: that first it is well known that the King is the child and servant of God, and they but the servants to the devil, he is the Lord's anointed, and they but vessels of God's wrath. He is a true Christian, and trusteth in God, they worse than infidels, for they only trust in the devil, who daily serve them, till he have brought them to utter destruction. But hereby it seemeth that his Highness carried a magnanimous and undaunted mind, not feared with their enchantments, but resolute in this, that so long as God is with him he feareth not who is against him. And true lie, the whole scope of this treatise doth so plainly lie open the wonderful providence of the Almighty, that if he had not been defended by his omnipotence and power, his Highness had never returned alive in his voyage from Denmark. So there is no doubt but God would as well defend him on the land as on the sea, where they pretended their damnable practice. Finis. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Another account of the foregoing transactions. Extracted from Sir James Melville's Memoirs, page 388, octavo edition. About this time many witches were taken in Lothian, who deposed concerning some design of the Earl of Bothwell's against his Majesty's person. Which coming to the said Earl's ears, he entered and warred within the castle of Edinburgh, desiring to be tried, alleging that the devil, who was a liar from the beginning, ought not to be credited, nor yet the witches, his sworn servants. Especially a renowned midwife called Amy Simpson affirmed, that she, in company with 9 other witches, being convened in the night beside Prestonpans, the devil their master being present, standing in the midst of them, a body of wax, shapen and made by the said Amy Simpson, wrapped within a linen cloth, was first delivered to the devil. Who, after he had pronounced his verdict, delivered the said picture to Amy Simpson, and she to her next neighbour, and so every one round about, saying, This is King James the Sixth. Ordered to be consumed at the instance of a nobleman, Francis Earl Bothwell. Afterward again at their meeting by night in the kirk of North Berwick, where the devil, clad in a black gown, with a black hat upon his head, preached unto a great number of them out of the pulpit, having light candles round about him. The effect of his language was to know what hurt they had done, how many they had gained to their opinion since the last meeting, what success the melting of the picture had, and such other vain things. And because an old silly poor ploughman, called Greymealt, chanced to say, that nothing ailed the king yet, God be thanked, the devil gave him a great blow. Thus divers among them entreed in reasoning, marvelling that all their devilry could do no harm to the king, as it had done to divers others. The devil answered, Illinois est un homme de Dieu, certainly he is a man of God, and does no wrong wittingly, but he is inclined to all godliness, justice, and virtue, therefore God hath preserved him in the midst of many dangers. 5 Now, after that the devil had ended his admonitions, he came down out of the pulpit, and caused all the company come kiss his arse. Which they said was cold like ice, his body hard like iron, as they thought who handled him, his face was terrible, his nose like the beak of an eagle, great burning eyes, his hands and his legs were hoary, with claws upon his hands and feet like the griffin. He spoke with a low voice. The tricks and tragedies he played then among so many men and women in this country, will hardly get credit by posterity. The history whereof, with their whole depositions, was written by Mr. James Carmichael, minister of Haddington. 6 Among other things, some of them did shew, that there was a Westland man, called Richard Graham, who had a familiar spirit, the which Richard they said could both do and tell many things, chiefly against the Earl of Bothwell. Whereupon the said Richard Graham was apprehended and brought to Edinburgh. And, being examined before his Majesty, I being present, he granted that he had a familiar spirit which shewed him sundry things, but he denied that he was a witch, or had any frequentation with them. But when it was answered again, how that Amy Simpson had declared, that he caused the Earl of Bothwell address him to her, he granted that to be true, and that the Earl of Bothwell had knowledge of him by F. Maccallum and Barbary Napier. Edinburgh Women. Whereupon he was sent for by the Earl Bothwell, who required his help to cause the King's Majesty his master to like well of him. And to that effect he gave the said Earl some drug or herb, willing him at some convenient time to touch there with his Majesty's face. Which being done by the said Earl ineffectually, he dealt again with the said Richard to get his Majesty wrecked, as Richard alleged. Who said, he could not do such things himself, but that a notable midwife, who was a witch, called Amy Simpson, could bring any such purpose to pass. Thus far the said Richard Graham affirmed divers times before the council. Nevertheless, he was burnt with the said Simpson, and many other witches. This Richard all edged, that it was certain what is reported of the fairies, and that spirits may take a form, and be seen, though not felt. Advertisement. From the foregoing true discourse, it will be seen what an active part James took in the examination of Dr. Fian and the other witches. From this source he most probably collected those materials which he has wrought up into a Daemonologie, a work which no doubt contributed to obtain for him from the English bishops, the appellation of the British Solomon. In this work he appears to be more intimately acquainted with the internal polity of the devil's kingdom, than he was with his own. The kingdom of Sathan was then in its zenith of power. But, like other states and kingdoms, it has sunk into great weakness and debility. The horned deal, who could then make the greatest personages shake in their shoes, cannot now frighten a child. And the roaring lion, who used to be going about seeking whom he might devour, must surely be a better housekeeper than formerly, as he is never seen abroad, even by an old woman. From the Daemonologie we have made copious extracts, that our readers may have an idea of the days of Lang Syne, when there was plenty of deils, witches, fairies, and water kelpies, all over the country. Those, therefore, who are anxious to know how affairs are managed in the kingdom of darkness, and can rely on the word of a king for the truth of it, will be here amply gratified. So, courteous reader, I bid thee farewell. The Editor. Extracts from King James's Daemonologie, concerning sorcery and witchcraft. The first interest and prenticeship of them that give themselves to witchcraft. The persons that give themselves to witchcraft, are of two sorts, rich and of better accompt, poor and of baser degree. These two degrees answer to the passions in them, which the devil uses as means to entice them to his service. For such of them as are in great misery and poverty, he allures to follow him, by promising unto them great riches and worldly commodity. Such as though rich, yet burn in a desperate desire of revenge, he allures them by promises to get their turn satisfied to their heart's contentment. It is to be noted now, that old and crafty enemy of ours assails none, though touched with any of these two extremities, except he first find an interest ready for him either by the great ignorance of the person he deals with, joined with an evil life, or else by their carelessness and contempt of God. And finding them in an utter despair, he prepares the way by feeding them craftily in their humor, and filling them further and further with despair, while he find the time proper to discover himself unto them. At which time, either upon their walking solitary in the fields, or else lying pausing in their bed, but always without the company of any other, he, either by a voice, or in likeness of a man, inquires of them what troubles them. And promiseth them a sudden and certain way of remedy, upon condition, on the other part, that they follow his advice, and do such things as he will require of them. Their mindies being prepared beforehand, they easily agree unto that demand of his, and sign sets another tryst where they may meet again. At which time, before he proceed any further with them, he first persuades them to addict themselves to his service, which being easily obtained, he then discovers what he is unto them, makes them to renounce their God and baptism directly, and gives them his mark upon some secret place of their body, which remains sore unhealed while his next meeting with them, and thereafter ever insensible, howsoever it be nipped or pricked by any, as is daily proved. To give them a proof thereby, that as in that doing he could hurt and heal them, so all their ill and well-doing thereafter must depend upon him. And, besides that, the intolerable dolour that they feel in that place where he hath marked them, serves to waken them, and not to let them rest, while their next meeting again. Fearing lest otherways they might either forget him, being as new prentices, and not well enough founded yet in that fiendly folly. Or else remembering of that horrible promise they made him at their last meeting, they might scunner at the same, and praysa to call it back. At their third meetinga, he makes a shew to be careful to perform his promises, either by teaching them ways how to get themselves revenged, if they be of that sort, or else by teaching them lessons how by most vile and unlawful means they may obtain gain and worldly commodity, if they be of the other sort. The witches' actions divided into two parts, the actions proper to their own persons, the for me of their conventions and adoring of their master. Their actions may be divided into two parts. the actions of their own persons, and the actions proceeding from them towards any other, and this division being well understood, will easily resolve what is possible to them to do. For although all that they confess is no lie upon their part, yet doubtlessly, in my opinion, a part of it is not indeed according as they take it to be, for the devil eludes the senses of these scholars of his in many things. To the effect that they may perform such services of their false master as he employs them in, the devil, as God's ape, counterfeits in his servants this service and for me of adoration that God prescribed and made his servants to practice. For as the servants of God publicly used to convene for serving of him, so makes he them in great numbers to convene, though publicly they dare not, for his service. As none convenes to the adoration and worshipping of God, except they be marked with his seal, the sacrament of baptism, so none serve Satan, and convenes to the adoring of him, that are not marked with that mark whereof I already spake. As the minister sent by God teacheth plainly at the time of their public conventions, how to serve him in spirit and truth, so that unclean spirit, in his own person, teacheth his disciples at the time of their convening how to work all kind of mischief, and craves compt of all their horrible and detestable proceedings past for advancement of his service, yea, that he may the more vilely counterfeit and scorn God. He oft times makes his slaves to convene in these very places which are destinate and ordained for the convening of the servants of God, I mean by churches. But this foray which I have yet said, I not only take it to be true in their opinions, but even so to be indeed, for me that he used in counterfeiting God amongst the Gentiles, makes me so to think. As God spake by his oracles, spake he not so by his? As God had as well bloody sacrifices, as others without blood, had not he the like? As God had churches sanctified to his service, with altars, priests, sacrifices, ceremonies, and prayers, had he not the like polluted to his service? As God gave responses by Urim and Thummim, gave he not his responses by the entralls of beasts, by the singing of fowls, and by their actions in the air? As God by visions, dreams, and ecstasies, revealed what was to come, and what was his will unto his servants, used he not the like means to forewarn his slaves of things to come? Yea, even as God loved cleanness, hated vice and impurity, and appointed punishments therefore, used he not the like, though foully I grant, and but in eschewing the less inconvenience, to draw them upon a greater, yet dissimulated he not. I say, so far as to appoint his priests to keep their bodies clean and undefiled, before their asking responses of him. And feigned he not God, to be a protector of every virtue, and a just revenger of the contrary? This reason then moves me, that as he is that same devil, and as crafty now as he was then, so will he not spare as pertly in these actions that I have spoken of concerning the witches' persons. But further, witches oft times confess, not only his convening in the church with them, but his occupying of the pulpit, yea, there for me of adoration to be the kissing of his hinder parts, which, though it see me ridiculous, yet may it likewise be true, seeing we read that in Calicut he appeared in for me of a goat buck, hath publicly that unhonest homage done unto him by every one of the people. So ambitious is he, and greedy of honor, which procured his fall, that he will even imitate God in that part where it is said, that Moises could see but the hinder parts of God for the brightness of his glory. What are the ways possible whereby the witches may transport themselves to places far distant, and what are impossible and mere illusions of Satan? Phi. But by what way say they, or think ye it possible, they can come to these unlawful conventions? 7. AP. There is the thing which I esteem their senses to be deluded in, and though they lie not in confessing of it, because they think it to be true, yet not to be so in substance or effect. For they say, that by divers means they may convene, either to the adoring of their master, or to the putting in practice any service of his committed unto their charge. One way is natural, which is natural riding, going, or sailing, at what hour their master comes and advertises them, and this way may be easily believed. Another way is somewhat more strange, and yet it is possible to be true, which is, by being carried by the force of the Spirit, which is their conductor, either above the earth, or above the sea, swiftly to the place where they are to meet. Which I am persuaded to be likewise possible, in respect, that as Habakkuk was carried by the angel in that for me to the den where Daniel lay, so I think the devil will be ready to imitate God as well in that as in other things. Which is much more possible to him to do, being a spirit, than to a mighty wind, being but a natural meteor to transport from one place to another a soul-eyed body, as is commonly in daily seen in practice. But in this violent for me they cannot be carried but a short bounds, agreeing with the space that they may retain their breath, for if it were longer, their breath could not remain unextinguished. Their body being carried in such a violent and forcible manner. As by example, if one fall off a small height, his life is but in peril, according to the hard or soft lighting. But if one fall from an high and stay rock, his breath will be forcibly banished from the body before he can win to the earth, as is oft seen by experience. And in this transporting they say themselves, that they are invisible to any other, except amongst themselves, which may also be possible in my opinion. For if the devil may for me what kind of impressions he pleases in the air, why may he not foray easily or thicken and obscure so the air that is next about them, by contracting it straight together, that the beams of any other man's eyes cannot pierce through the same to see them? But the third way of their coming to their conventions is that wherein I think them deluded. For some of them say, that being transformed in the likeness of a little beast or foule, they will come and pierce through whatsoever house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatsoever open the air may enter in at. And some say, that their bodies lying still, as in an ecstasy, their spirits will be ravished out of their bodies, and carried to such places. And for verifying thereof, will give evident tokens, as well by witnesses that have seen their body lying senseless in the meantime, as by naming persons with whom they met, and giving tokens what purpose was amongst them, whom otherwise they could not have known. For this for me of journeying they affirm to use most, when they are transported from one country to another. Fi. But the reasons that move me to think that these are mere illusions, are these: first, for them that are transformed in likeness of beasts or foals, can enter through so narrow passages. Although I may easily believe that the devil could by his workmanship upon the air, make them appear to be in such forms, either to themselves, or to others. Yet how can he contract a soul-eyed body within so little room? I think it is directly contrary to itself, for to be made so little, and yet not diminished. To be so straightly drawn together, and yet feel no pain, I think it is so contrary to the quality of a natural body, and so like to the little transubstantiate God in the Papists' Mass, that I can never believe it. So to have a quantity, is so proper to a soul-eyed body, that as all philosophers conclude, it cannot be any more without one, than a spirit can have one. For when Peter came out of the prison, and the doors all locked, it was not by any contracting of his body in so little room, but by the giving place of the door, though unespied by the gaolers. And yet is there no comparison, when this is done, betwixt the power of God and of the devil. As to there for me of ecstasy in spiritual transporting, it is certain the soul's going out of the body, is the only definition of natural death. And who are once dead, God forbid we should think that it should lie in the power of all the devils in hell to restore them to their life again, although he can put his own spirit in a dead body, for that is the office properly belonging to God. And, besides that, the soul once parting from the body, cannot wander any longer in the world, but to the own resting place must it go immediately, abiding the conjunction of the body again at the latter day. And what Christ or the prophets did miraculously in this case, it can in no Christian man's opinion be made common with the devil. As for any tokens that they give for proving of this, it is very possible to the devil's craft to persuade them to these means. For he being a spirit, may he not so ravish their thoughts, and dull their senses, that their body lying is dead, he may object to their spirits, as it were in a dream, and represent such forms of persons, of places, and other circumstances, as he pleases to elude them with. Yea, that he may deceive them with the greater efficacy, may he not, at the same instant, by fellow angels of his, elude such other persons so in that same fashion, with whom he makes them to believe that they meta. That all their reports and tokens, though severally examined, may every one agree with another. And that whatsoever actions, either in hurting men or beasts, or whatsoever other thing that they foully imagine at that time to have done, may by himself or his marrows at that same time be done indeed. So as if they would give for a token of their being ravished at the death of such a person within so short a space thereafter, whom they believe to have poisoned or witched at that instant. Might he not at that same hour have smitten that same person, by the permission of God, to the farther deceiving of them, and to move others to believe them? And this is surely the likeliest way, and most according to reason, which my judgment can find out in this and whatsoever other unnatural points of their confession. Witches' actions towards others, why there are more women of that craft than men, what things are possible to them to effectuate by the power of their master, what is the surest remedy of the harms done by them. Fie. Forsooth your opinion in this seems to carry most reason with it, and since ye have ended then the actions belonging properly to their own persons, say forward now to their actions used towards others. A.P. In their actions used towards others, 3 things ought to be considered: first, the manner of their consulting thereupon; next, their part as instruments; and, last, their master's part, who puts the same in execution. As to their consultations thereupon, they use them oftest in the churches, where they convene for adoring. At which time their master inquiring at them what they would be at, every one of them propones unto him what wicked turn they would have done, either for obtaining of riches, or for revenging them upon any whom they have malice at. Who granting their demand, as no doubt willingly he will, since it is to do evil, he teacheth them the means whereby they may do the same. As for little trifling turns that women have ado with, he causeth them to joint dead corpses, and to make powders thereof, mixing such other things thereamongst as he gives unto them. Fie. But before ye go further, permit me, I pray you, to interrupt you one word, which ye have put me in memory of by speaking of women. What can be the cause that there are 20 women given to that craft where there is one man? A.P. The reason is easy, for as that sex is frilier than man is, so is it easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the devil, as was overwell proved to be true, by the serpent's deceiving of Eve at the beginning. Which makes him the homelier with that sex and sign. Fie. Return now where ye left. A.P. To some others at these times he teacheth how to make pictures of wax or clay, that by the roasting thereof, the persons that they bear the name of may be continually melted or dried away by continual sickness. To some he gives such stones or powders as will help to cure or cast on diseases, and to some he teacheth kinds of uncouth poisons, which mediciners understand not. Not that any of these means which he teacheth them, except the poisons, which are composed of things natural, can of themselves help anything to these turns that they are employed in, but only being God's ape, as well in that, as in all other things. Even as God by his sacraments, which are earthly of themselves, works a heavenly effect, though no waves by any cooperation in them. And as Christ by clay and spittle wrought together, opened the eyes of the blind man, suppose there was no virtue in that which he outwardly applied, so the devil will have his outward means to be shews as it were of his doing, which hath no part or cooperation in his turns with him, how fare that ever the ignorance be abused in the contrary. And as to the effects of these 2 former parts, to wit, the consultations and the outward means, they are so wonderful, as I dare not allege any of them without joining a sufficient reason of the possibility thereof. For leaving all the small trifles among wives, and to speak of the principal points of their craft, for the common trifles thereof, they can do without converting well enough by themselves. These principal points, I say, are these: they can make men or women to love or hate other, which may be very possible to the devil to effectuate, seeing he being a subtle spirit, knows well enough how to persuade the corrupted affection of them whom God will permit him to deal with. They can lay the sickness of one upon another, which likewise is very possible unto him. For since by God's permission he laid sickness upon Job, why may he not fare easilier lay it upon any other? For as an old practician, he knows well enough what humour domines most in any of us, and as a spirit he can subtly waken up the same, making it peccant, or to abound, as he thinks meet, for troubling of us, when God will so permit him. And for the taking off of it, no doubt he will be glad to relieve such of present pain as he may think by these means to persuade to be catched in his everlasting snares and fetters. They can bewitch and take the life of men or women, by roasting of the pictures, as I spake of before, which likewise is very possible to their master to perform. For although that instrument of wax have no virtue in that turn doing, yet may he not very well, even by the same measure that his conjured slaves melts that wax at the fire, may he not, I say, at these same times, subtly as a spirit, so weaken and scatter the spirits of life of the patient, as may make him on the one part, for faintness, to sweat out the humour of his body, and on the other part, for the not concurrence of these spirits, which causes his digestion. So debilitate his stomach, that this humour radicale continually, sweating out on the one part, and no new good sup being put in the place thereof, for lack of digestion on the other, he at last shall vanish away. Even as his picture will dough at the fire. And that knavish and cunning workman, by troubling him onely at sometimes, makes a proportion so near betwixt the working of the one and the other, that both shall end as it were at one time. They can raise storms and tempests in the air, either upon sea or land, though not universally, but in such a particular place and prescribed bounds, as God will permit them so to trouble. Which likewise is very easy to be discerned from any other natural tempests that are meteors, in respect of the sudden and violent raising thereof, together with the short enduring of the same. And this is likewise very possible to their master to do, he having such affinity with the air, as being a spirit, and having such power of the forming and moving thereof. For in the Scripture, that style of the prince of the air, is given unto him. They can make folks to become frantique or maniaque, which likewise is very possible to their master to do, since they are but natural sicknesses, and so he may lay on these kins as well as any others. They can make spirits either to follow and trouble persons, or haunt certain houses, and affray oftentimes the inhabitants, as hath been known to be done by our witches at this time. And likewise, they can make some to be possessed with spirits, and so to become very demoniacs. And this last sort is very possible likewise to the divil their master to do, since he may easily send his own angels to trouble in what for me he pleases any whom God will permit him so to use. Fi. But will God permit these wicked instruments, by the power of the devil their master, to trouble by any of these means any that believe in him? A.P. No doubt, for there are three kins of folks whom God will permit so to be tempted or troubled, the wicked for their horrible sins, to punish them in the like measure. The godly that are sleeping in any great sins or infirmities, and weakness in faith, to waken them up the faster by such an uncouth for me, and even some of the best, that their patience may be tried before the world, as Job's was. For why may not God use any kind of extraordinary punishment, when it pleases him, as well as the ordinary rods of sickness or other adversities? Fi. Who then may be free from these devilish practices? A.P. No man ought to presume so far as to promise any impunity to himself. For God hath before all beginnings, preordinated as well the particular sorts of plagues, as of benefits, for every man, which in the own time he ordains them to be visited with. And yet ought we not to be the more afraid for that, of any thing that the devil and his wicked instruments can do against us, for we daily fight against the devil in 100 other ways. And therefore, as a valiant captain affrays no more being at the comate, nor stays from his purpose for the rummishing shot of a cannon, nor the small clack of a pistolet, suppose he be not certain what may light upon him. Even so ought we boldly to go forward in fighting against the devil, without any great terror for these his rarest weapons, nor for the ordinary, whereof we have daily the proof. Fi. Is it not lawful then, by the help of some other witch, to cure the disease that is casten on by that craft? A.P. No ways lawful, for it is an axiom of theology, that we are not to do evil, that good may come of it. Fi. How then may these diseases be lawfully cured? A.P. Only by earnest prayer unto God, by amendment of their lives, and by sharp pursuing every one, according to his calling of these instruments of Satan, whose punishment to the death will be a salutary sacrifice for the patient. And this is not only the lawful way, but likewise the most sure, for by the devil's means can never the devil be casten out, as Christ saith. And when such a cure is used, it may well serve for a short time, but at the last it will doubtlessly tend to the utter perdition of the patient, both in body and soul. What sort of folks are least or most subject to receive harm by witchcraft, what power they have to harm the magistrate? And upon what respects they have any power in prison, and to what end may or will the devil appear to them therein, upon what respects the devil appears in sundry shapes to sundry of them at any time. But who dare take upon him to punish them, if no man can be sure to be free from their unnatural invasions? We ought not the more of that restrain from virtue, that the way whereby we climb thereunto be straight and perilous. But, besides that, as there is no kind of persons so subject to receive harm of them, as these that are of infirm and weak faith, so have they so small power over none, as over such as zealously and earnestly pursue them. Then they are like the pest which smites these sickest that flies it farthest. It is even so with them, for neither is it able to them to use any false cure upon a patient, except the patient first believe in their power, and so hazard the tinsel of his own soul, nor yet can they have less power to hurt any. Nor such as contemn most their doings, so being it comes of faith, and not of any vain arrogancy in themselves. But what is their power against the magistrate? Less or greater, according as he deals with them, for if he be slothful towards them, God is very able to make them instruments to waken and punish his sloth. But if he be the contrary, he, according to the just law of God, an allowable law of all nations, will be diligent in examining and punishing of them. God will not permit their master to trouble or hinder so good a work. But fra they be once in hands and ferments, have they any further power in their craft? That is according to the forme of their detention. If they be but apprehended and detained by any private person, upon other private respects, their power no doubt, either in escaping, or in doing hurt, is no less nor ever it was before. But if, on the other part, their apprehending and detention be by the lawful magistrate, upon the just respects of their guiltiness in that craft, their power is then no greater than before that ever they medled with their master. For where God begins justly to strike by his lawful lieutenants, it is not in the devil's power to defraud or bereave him of the office, or effect of his powerful and revenging scepter. But will never their master come to visit them fra they be once apprehended and put in ferments? That is according to the estate that these miserable wretches are in, for if they be obstinate in still denying, he will not spare, when he finds time to speak with them, either if he find them in any comfort, to fill them more and more with the vain hope of some manner of relief, or else if he find them in a deep despair, by all means to augment the same, and to persuade them by some extraordinary means to put themselves down. Which very commonly they do. But if they be penitent and confess, God will not permit him to trouble them any more with his presence and allurements. It is not good using his counsel I see then. But I would earnestly know, when he appears to them in prison, what forms uses he then to take? Divers forms, even as he uses to do at other times unto them, but ordinarily in such a forme as they agree upon among themselves. Or, if they be but prentices, according to the quality of their circles or conjurations, yet to these capped creatures he appears as he pleases, and as he finds meetest for their humours. For even at their public conventions, he appears to divers of them in divers forms, as we have found by the difference of their confessions in that point. For he deluding them with vain impressions in the air, makes himself to seem more terrible to the grosser sort, that they may thereby be moved to fear and reverence him the more. And less monstrous and uncouth like again to the craftier sort, lest otherwise they might stir and scunner at his ugliness. How can he then be felt, as they confess they have done, if his body be but of air? I hear little of that amongst their confessions, yet may he make himself palpable, either by assuming any dead body, and using the ministry thereof, or else by deluding as well their sense of feeling as seeing. Which is not impossible to him to do, since all our senses, as we are so weak, and even by ordinary sicknesses, will be oftentimes deluded. But I would speer one word further yet concerning his appearing to them in prison, which is this: may any other that chances to be present at that time in the prison see him as well as they? AP. Sometimes they will, and sometimes not, as it pleases God. Of the trial and punishment of witches, what sort of accusation ought to be admitted against them? What is the cause of the increasing so far of their number in this age? Phi. Then to make an end of our conference, since I see it draws late, what for me of punishment think ye merit these witches? AP. They ought to be put to death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law, and municipal law of all Christian nations. Phi. But what kind of death, I pray you? AP. It is commonly used by fire, but that is an indifferent thing to be used in every country, according to the law or custom thereof. Phi. But ought no sex, age, nor ranka, to be exempted? AP. None at all, being so used by the lawful magistrate, for it is the highest point of idolatry wherein no exception is admitted by the law of God. Phi. Then barns may not be spared. AP. Yea, not a hair the less of my conclusion, for they are not that capable of reason as to practice such things, and for any being in company, and not revailing thereof, their less and ignorant age will no doubt excuse them. Phi. I see ye condemn them all that are of the counsel of such crafts. AP. No doubt the consulters, trusters in, overseers, entertainers, or stirrers up of these crafts folks, are equally guilty with themselves that are the practisers. Phi. Whether may the prince then, or supreme magistrate, spare or oversee any that are guilty of that craft, upon some great respects known to him? AP. The prince or magistrate, for further trial's cause, may continue the punishing of them such a certain space as he thinks convenient, but in the end to spare the life, and not to strike when God bids strike. And so severely punish in so odious a fault and treason against God, it is not only unlawful, but doubtless no less sin in that magistrate, nor it was in Saul's sparing of Agag. And so comparable to the sin of witchcraft itself, as Samuel alleged at that time. Phi. Surely then, I think since this crime ought to be so severely punished, judges ought to beware to condemn any but such as they are sure are guilty, neither should the clattering report of a carling serve in so weighty a case. AP. Judges ought indeed to beware whom they condemn, for it is as great a crime, as Solomon saith, to condemn the innocent as to let the guilty escape free. Neither ought the report of any one infamous person be admitted for a sufficient proof which can stand of no law. Phi. And what may a number of guilty persons' confessions work against one that is accused? AP. The assize must serve for interpreter of our law in that respect, but in my opinion, since in a matter of treason against the prince, barns or wives, or never so defamed persons, may of our law serve for sufficient witnesses and proofs. I think surely that by a far greater reason such witnesses may be sufficient in matters of high treason against God. For who but witches can be proofs, and so witnesses of the doings of witches? Phi. Indeed, I trow they will be loath to put any honest man upon their counsel. But what if they accuse folky to have been present at their imaginer conventions in the spirit, when their bodies lie senseless, as ye have said? AP. I think they are not a hair the less guilty. For the devil durst never have borrowed their shadow or similitude to that turn, if their consent had not been at it, and the consent in these turns is death of the law. Phi. Then Samuel was a witch, for the devil resembled his shape, and played his person in giving response to Saul. AP. Samuel was dead as well before that, and so none could slander him with meddling in that unlawful arte. For the cause why, as I take it, that God will not permit Satan to use the shapes of similitudes of any innocent persons at such unlawful times is, that God will not permit that any innocent persons shall be slandered with that vile defection. For then the devil would find ways anew to calumniate the best. And this we have in proof by them that are carried with the fairy, who never see the shadows of any in that court but of them that thereafter are tried to have been brethren and sisters of that craft. And this was likewise proved by the confession of a young lassie troubled with spirits, laid on her by witchcraft, that although she saw the shapes of divers men and women troubling her, and naming the persons whom these shadows represent, yet never one of them are found to be innocent, but all clearly tried to be most guilty, and the most part of them confessing the same. And, besides that, I think it hath been seldom heard tell of, that any whom persons guilty of that crime accused, as having known them to be their marrows by eyesight, and not by hearsay, but such as were so accused of witchcraft, could not be clearly tried upon them, were at the least publicly known to be of a very evil life and reputation. So jealous is God of the fame of them that are innocent in such causes. And, besides that, there are two other good helps that may be used for their trial, the one is, the finding of their mark, and the trying the insensibleness thereof. The other is their fleeting on the water, for as in a secret murder, if the dead carcass be at any time thereafter handled by the murderer, it will gush out of bloud, as if the bloud were crying to the heaven for revenge of the murderer. God having appointed that secret supernatural signa for trial of that secret unnatural crime, so it appears that God hath appointed, for a supernatural signa of the monstrous impiety of witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom that have shaken off them the sacred water of baptism, and wilfully refused the benefity thereof. No, not so much as their eyes are able to shed tears, threaten and torture them as ye please, while first they repent, God not permitting them to dissemble their obstinacy in so horrible a crime, albeit the womenkind especially be able otherways to shed tears at every light occasion when they will, yea, although it were dissemblingly like the crocodiles. Fie. Well, we have made this conference to last as long as leisure would permit. And to conclude then, since I am to take my leave of you, I pray God to purge this Count Ray of these devilish practices, for they were never so rife in these parts as they are now. Ap. I pray God that so be too. But the causes are over manifest that make them to be so rife, for the great wickedness of the people on the one hand, procures this horrible defection, whereby God justly punisheth sin by a greater iniquity. And on the other part, the consummation of the world and our deliverance drawing near, makes Satan to rage the more in his instruments, knowing his kingdom to be so near an end. And so farewell for this time. The end. An answer of a letter from a gentleman in Fife. To a nobleman containing a brief account of the barbarous and illegal treatment these poor women accused of witchcraft met with from the bailies of Pittenweem and others, with some observations thereon. To which is added, an account of the horrid and barbarous murder, in a letter from a gentleman in Fife to his friend in Edinburgh, February 5, 1705. Printed in the year 1705. The two following tracts give an account of the witches of Pittenweem in 1705. The first is a concise relation of facts, in which the minister and magistrates are placed in no very favourable point of view. The second is an answer to the first, and seems chiefly intended to obviate the charges that are preferred against the minister and bailies, but in our opinion with no great success, as the principal facts are admitted. And the only defense set up is, that the women were in reality witches. We have given this author's story in his own words, with such of his remarks as bear upon the narrative of the other pamphlet, which is all that is necessary at the present day. Editor. An answer of a letter from a gentleman in Fife, Enc. My Lord, I reckon myself very much honoured by your lordship's letter, desiring me to write you an account of that horrible murder committed in Pittenweem. I doubt not, but by this time, your lordship has seen the gentleman's letter to his friend there anent. I refer you to it, the author thereof being so well informed, and so ingenious, that I'll assure you, there is nothing in it but what is generally talked and believed to be true. All I can contribute to your lordship's further information, shall be by way of a brief narrative of the minister and bailie's unwarrantable imprisoning, and barbarous treating of the poor women. I need not write your lordship a character of Patrick Morton, being now sufficiently known for a cheat. It was upon his accusation allenly the minister and bailies imprisoned these poor women, and set a guard of drunken fellows about them, who by pinching and pricking some of them with pins and elzirons, kept them from sleep for several days and nights together, the marks whereof were seen by severals a month thereafter. This cruel usage made some of them learn to be so wise as acknowledge every question that was asked them, whereby they found the minister and bailies well pleased, and themselves better treated. Notwithstanding of all this, some of the more foolish continued, as the minister said, hardened in the devil's service, such as White, Jack, Wallace, Patrick, and others. All which, save the first, were ordered to the stocks, where they lay for several weeks. All this while Patrick Morton's melancholy fancy, to give it no harsher term, being too much encouraged by severals, and particularly by the minister's reading to him the case of Barbarous' daughter, continued roving after a wonderful manner, accusing for his tormentors some of the most considerable men's wives in the town, but such as the minister and bailies durst not venture to imprison. By this your lordship may see, it was only the weakest that went to the walls. My Lord Rothes, accompanied with several gentlemen of good sense and reputation, came to Pittenweem, where finding these poor women's confessions no wise satisfying, and Patrick Morton a cheat, informed the Privy Council thereof, who sent an order to send Patrick over to them. This turn being given, and Patrick finding that things were not likely to go so favourably with him as he before fancied, began to draw to his breeches, and in a short time recovered his former health, in which he still continues. By this time the bailies began to be as earnest in emptying their prisons, as ever they were forward in filling them. So after a long and serious deliberation, they set them at liberty, but that their last step might be as illegal as their first, obliged each of them to pay the town officer the sum of 8 lib Scots. To pay which, some of them were forced to sell some linen they had reserved for their dead shirts and winding sheets. I beg your lordship's further patience a little to read these few following observations, OBS. First, the bailies and minister sent and brought several of these women from places without their jurisdiction, one from Anstruther, and another from the country at 6 miles distance. OBS. 2d. What good could the minister propose to Patrick Morton by reading to him the book intituled The Case of Barbarous' Daughter? OBS. 3d. After so much injustice done to these poor women, the bailies and minister obliged them to pay the town officer £8 Scots, is worthy of your lordship and the rest of the lords of the Privy Council's considerations. And it would be the height of charity to fall on a method to oblige the minister and bailies to refound it sevenfold. OBS. 4th, one Thomas Brown, the only man accused by Patrick Morton, and imprisoned by the minister and bailies, after a great deal of hunger and hardship, died in prison, so as this poor woman's murder was not the first, neither will it be the last, unless by severe punishments prevented. OBS 5th, the bailies in a manner justified these 2 murthers, by not allowing them Christian burial, but burying them like dogs, scarce covering them from the ravens. OBS. 6th, you may wonder why all along I should say the minister and bailies. The reason is, because during all this narrative he exercised more of the civil authority than any of the bailies, and so continues to do, as you may see by the following late instance. The bailies of Pittenweem being convened before the Lords of Privy Council on the 14th or 15th of February, I am informed gave in to them a subscribed account of the murder. And to justify themselves, assert they had imprisoned several of the murderers before they left Pittenweem. It is very true they did so, but they were not long from the town when the minister set them at liberty. This, I think, is exercising the office of a civil magistrate. Perhaps the minister may say he did it by the magistrate's order left behind them. Then I think the magistrates were mightily in the wrong to give in to the lords of the Privy Council an account they knew to be false. My lord, this is not the 10th part of what may be said upon this subject. I hope some other person will be more particular. I am, my lord, your lordship's most humble servant. An account of an horrid and barbarous murder. In a letter from a gentleman in Fife to his friend in Edinburgh. I doubt not of your being exceedingly surprised with this short and just account I give you of a most barbarous murder committed in Pittenweem the 30th of January last. One Peter Morton, a blacksmith in that town, after a long sickness, pretended that witches were tormenting him, that he did see them and know them, and, from time to time, as he declared such and such women to be witches. They were by order of the magistrates and minister of Pittenweem, apprehended as such, to a very considerable number, and put into prison. This man, by his odd postures and fits, which seemed to be very surprising at first, wrought himself into such a credit with the people of that place, that unless the Earl of Rothes, our sheriff, had discovered his villainy, and discouraged that practice, God knows how fatal it might have proved to many honest families of good credit and respect. Sir, however, at first many were deceived, yet now all men of sense are ashamed for giving any credit to such a person. But how hard it is to root out bad principles once espoused by the rabble, and how dangerous a thing it is to be at their mercy, will appear by the tragical account I give you of one of these poor women, Janet Corpat. After she was committed prisoner to the Tolbooth, upon a suspicion of her being a witch, she was well guarded with a number of men, who, by pinching her, and pricking her with pins, kept her from sleep many days and nights, threatening her with present death, unless she would confess herself guilty of witchcraft. Which at last she did. This report spreading abroad, made people curious to converse with her upon the subject, who found themselves exceedingly disappointed. The Viscount of Primrose being in Fife occasionally, inclined to satisfy his curiosity in this matter, the Earl of Kelly, my Lord Lyon, the Laird of Scottstarvat, and the Laird of Randerston, were with his lordship in Pittenweem. 3 of the number went to the Tolbooth and discoursed with her, to whom she said, that all that she had confessed, either of herself or her neighbours, were lies, and cried out, God forgive the minister, and said, that he had beat her one day with his staff when she was telling him the truth. They asked her how she came to say anything that was not true. She cried out, Alas, alas, I behoved to say so, to please the minister and bailies. And, in the meantime, she begged for Christ's sake not to tell that she had said so, else she would be murdered. Another time, when the Laird of Glenagees and Mr. Bruce of Kinross were telling her, she needed not deny what they were asking her, for she had confessed as much as would infallibly burn her, she cried out, God forbid. And to one of the two she said, that from which he might rationally conclude, she insinuated she had assurance from the minister her life should not be taken. A little before harvest, Mr. Kerr of Kippelaw, a writer to the Signet, being in Pittenweem, Mr. Robert Cook, advocate, went with him to prison to see this poor woman. Mr. Cook, among other questions, asked her, if she had not renounced her baptism to the devil. She answered, she never renounced her baptism but to the minister. These were her words, what she meant by them I know not. The minister having got account of this from Mr. Cook, he sent for her, and in presence of Mr. Cook and Mr. Kerr in the church, he threatened her very severely, and commanded the keeper to put her into some prison by herself under the steeple, lest, as he said, she should pervert those who had confessed. The keeper put her into a prison in which was a low window, out of which it was obvious that any body could make an escape, and, accordingly, she made her escape that night. Next day when they missed her, they made a very slight search for her, and promised £10 Scots to any body that would bring her back. Mr. Gordon, minister at Lutchers, hearing she was in his parish, 8 miles distant from Pittenweem, caused apprehend her, and sent her prisoner, under custody of 2 men, on the 30th of January, to Mr. Cooper, minister of Pittenweem, without giving any notice to the magistrates of the place. When she came to Mr. Cooper, she asked him if he had anything to say to her. He answered, no. She could get lodging in no house but with one Nicholas Lawson, one of the women that had been called witches. Some say a bailey put her there. The rabble hearing she was in town, went to Mr. Cooper, and asked him what they should do with her. He told them he was not concerned, they might do what they pleased with her. They took encouragement from this to fall upon the poor woman, those of the minister's family going along with them, as I hear. They fell upon the poor creature immediately, and beat her unmercifully, tying her so hard with a rope, that she was almost strangled. They dragged her through the streets, and alongst the shore, by the heels. A bailey, hearing of a rabble near his stair, came out upon them, which made them immediately disappear. But the magistrates, though met together, not taking care to put her into close custody for her safety, the rabble gathered again immediately, and stretched a rope betwixt a ship and the shore, to a great height, to which they tied her fast. After which they swinged her to and fro, from one side to another, in the meantime throwing stones at her from all corners, until they were weary. Then they loosed her, and with a mighty swing threw her upon the hard sands, all about being ready in the meantime to receive her with stones and staves, with which they beat her most cruelly. Her daughter, in the time of her mother's agony, though she knew of it, durst not adventure to appear, lest the rabble had used her after the same manner, being in a house, in great concern and terror, out of natural affection for her mother. About which the author was misinformed in the first edition. They laid a heavy door upon her, with which they pressed her so sore, that she cried out, to let her up for Christ's sake, and she would tell the truth. But when they did let her up, what she said could not satisfy them, and therefore, they again laid on the door, and with a heavy weight of stones on it, pressed her to death. And to be sure it was so, they called a man with a horse and a sledge, and made him drive over her corpse backward and forward several times. When they were sure she was killed outright, they dragged her miserable carcass to Nicholas Lawson's house, where they first found her. There was a motion made to treat Nicholas Lawson after the same manner immediately. But some of them being wearied with 3 hours' sport, as they called it, said it would be better to delay her for another day's divertisement, and so they all went off. It is said that Mr. Cooper, in a letter to Mr. Gordon, gave some rise to all this, and Mr. Cooper, to vindicate himself, wrote to Mr. Gordon, whose return says, if he were not going to Edinburgh, he would give him a double of his letter. It's strange he sent him not the principal. In the postscript, he assures him, he shall conceal it to meeting. 'Tis certain, that Mr. Cooper, preaching the Lord's Day immediately after, in Pittenweem, took no notice of the murder, which at least makes him guilty of sinful silence. Neither did Mr. Gordon, in his letter to Mr. Cooper, make any regret for it. And this some construe to be a justifying of the horrid wickedness in both. We are persuaded the government will examine this affair to the bottom, and lay little stress upon what the magistrates or minister of Pittenweem will say to smooth over the matter, seeing it's very well known that either of them could have quashed the rabble, and prevented that murder, if they had appeared zealous against it. I am sorry I have no better news to tell you. God deliver us from those principles that tend to such practices. I am, Sir, your humble servant. A just reproof to the false reports and unjust calumnies, in the foregoing letters. About the month of March last year, one Beatrix Lang, a woman of very bad fame, who had formerly been under process for using charms, and refusing to be reconciled to her neighbors, was debarred from the Lord's table, came to one Patrick Morton, a blacksmith, desiring him to make some nails, which he refused to do, because otherwise employed at that time. Upon which she went off muttering some threatening expressions. A little after, the said Patrick Morton, with another person in company, carrying some fish by the said Beatrix Lang's door, they saw a vessel with water placed at the door, with a burning coal in it. Upon which he was presently strucken with an impression that it was a charm designed against him, and upon this a little after he sickened. In this sickness he languished for a long time. Physicians that saw him, could not understand his distemper, yet tried various medicines, till at length his trouble increased, and he began to be seized with some unusual fits, which made them give over. He forbore all this while any accusation of the person whom he all along suspected for his trouble, at least he made no mention of it to the minister, who frequently visited him while under it. But his trouble still increasing, he at length began to drop some apprehensions of the cause of it. Upon which Beatrix Lang was called, and by the magistrates, in the said Patrick Morton's father's house, examined in presence of a great multitude of people, and owned, that she had placed that vessel with water, and the coal in it, there. But at that time would give no account of the reason of it. Being dismissed by the magistrates, she went home, and that same night, when she was challenged by Catherine Marshall, in her own house, before Nicholas Lawson, about the lad's trouble, she answered, that he might blame his own ill tongue for what had befallen him, and that it was an evil spirit that was troubling him. Which was in her face maintained by the said persons next day, in presence of the magistrates. Then the boy began to complain of her tormenting him, and fell into grievous fits of trouble upon her entering the house. Upon all which she being imprisoned, after some time did acknowledge to magistrates and minister, in presence of many witnesses, without threat or torture. Of which we shall speak more afterwards, that she was displeased with Patrick Morton for his refusing to make some nails. That she designed to be avenged upon him for it, and that she used that charm of the coal and the water against him, and that she renounced her baptism, entered into a compact with the devil some 12 years before. Condescending upon time, place, and her inducements to engage in his service, and that she, with Nicholas Lawson, had made a wax picture to torment him, and put pins in it. Which the said Nicholas likewise confessed afterwards, and so justified the boy's account of the rise of his trouble. After this the boy's trouble daily increased, in which there were many strange things. First his belly, for some time, then his breast, frequently heaved up to a prodigious height, and instantly went off again, by a blowing at the mouth like a bellows. Frequently he cried out that such persons as he named were pinching him in his arms, breast, or some other places of his body, his hands lying all the while above the clothes, at a distance from one another, in the view of many of the spectators. And when they looked the places of which he complained, they saw distinctly the print of nails. Again, he was frequently cast into swooning fits, became insensible, which was tried by exquisite pinching the more sensible parts of his body, of which he complained afterwards when he came out of the fits, though he took no notice of them, nor felt them, in the time while he was in these fits. The strongest who essayed to lift his head from the pillow, were not able to move it, though both his feet and head were perfectly free of the bed, which was exactly tried, yea. Sometimes while the trunk of his body and his head were thus rigid and could not be raised from the pillow, his legs were loose, and any might move them as they pleased. Sometimes these fits were not so great as at other times, and then, or when he was falling in, or coming out of them, several persons lifted him with little difficulty. But when he was in the depth of the fit, the strongest that essayed it could not raise him up. Again, when any of the women whom he accused touched him, and sometimes on their coming into the room he fell into grievous fits of trouble, and cried out, that such a person was tormenting him, condescending on their names. And this he did very frequently, before multitudes of people of different ranks, ready to attest the same. And commonly such care was taken to prevent his having any notice either of the women's entry, or which of them was there, that there was no place left for any rational suspicion of trick or cheat in the matter. He was carefully hoodwinked with several plies of cloth, the women were brought in with the utmost secrecy, innocent persons present in the room laid their hands on him, but yet he never shewed the least concern, save when the accused persons touched him. Several times gentlemen that seemed jealous that there was somewhat of an imposture in the case, were allowed and invited to make the nicest trial, and found it hold. Several pitiful cavils have been used about this, and other instances of the boy's trouble, which proceed either from ignorance of the circumstances of matter of fact, or gross inadvertency in not observing the several variations of the boy's case. Which, had they been considered, they would have been so far from giving any countenance to the conclusion aimed at by these objectors, that they would strongly have enforced a conviction of something preternatural in the case. The author then proceeds to give an account of Janet Corphat, the woman who was murdered. She was a person of very bad fame, who of a long time was reputed a witch, frequently used charms, and was wont commonly to threaten persons who disobliged her, and such consequences sometimes followed, as made her the terror of many, both of the town and country, which might be verified by particular instances, if it were necessary. She was not at first delayed by Patrick Morton, though afterwards he complained of her as one of his tormentors. But she, with several others, being in company with the devil, whereof Isobel Adam was one, in pursuance of a quarrel which Beatrix Lang, formerly mentioned, had with one Alexander Grigor, a fisher in the town, made an attempt to murder the said Grigor in bed, which was prevented by his awakening and wrestling against them. This attempt was acknowledged by Isobel Adam, of whose confession a more full account shall be given afterwards, who had been taken up on that man's delation, and some other informations against her, and not on the lad's. As likewise, the said Janet was accused by Nicholas Lawson, another person present at that attempt, and Nicholas accused her of being at another meeting in the Loan of Pittenweem, at both which meetings they confessed the devil was present. All which she herself afterwards freely confessed. The manner of this woman's confession was very remarkable. After she had obstinately some while denied, and with a subtlety beyond what might be expected from one of her education, shifted all questions put to her, she, with Isobel Adam aforesaid, being brought to the house where the tormented lad lay. And he discovering her at her entry into the room, notwithstanding the utmost precaution was used to conceal it from him, and he falling into grievous fits of trouble, did cry out of her as one of his tormentors. At which she was so stunned, that instantly she fell a-trembling. The magistrates and minister observing her in such a confusion, asked if she was willing to commune with them, in reference to the matters whereof she had been accused. She declaring herself willing, went with them to another place, and when desired to be ingenuous, she again fell a-trembling, and said she would confess all, but was afraid the devil would tear the soul out of her body if she did, and said, "If you will pray, and cause all good folk pray for me, I will confess," and she then desired the minister to pray. And, after prayer, confessed she was bodily present at both the meetings aforesaid with the devil and the witches, and gave a circumstantiate account of the renunciation of her baptism, naming time, place, and inducements which led her to it. And the shape the devil appeared to her in. She likewise told the reason of their attempt to murder Grigor was, that he did not hire a house which belonged to Beatrix Lang. Again, on a Thursday, after she had been hearing sermon, she desired to speak with the minister, and sent one to acquaint him with this desire. On which he went to her, and she, before several witnesses, renewed her former confession, and condescended on all the persons the other confessing witches had accused, as being present at the two foresaid meetings. Adding withal, that there were others present whom she knew not. This confession she renewed before the presbytery, in presence of a great many country gentlemen, and other spectators. As likewise in the face of a numerous congregation on the Lord's Day. It is owned, that when Beatrix Lang and Nicholas Lawson were first imprisoned, they were ill-used by some of the guard, without the knowledge of magistrates or minister, of which the women made complaint to the minister. Whereof he presently acquainted the magistrates, who, with the minister, went to the prison, and threatened the guard if they offered the least disturbance to persons in custody. And the minister, on the Lord's Day thereafter, took occasion in sermon to discover the wickedness of that practice, as being against the light of nature, Scripture, and the just laws of the land. After this, we heard of no more disturbances they met with. Now, it was not till after this precaution used to prevent their trouble, that Janet Corpat was imprisoned. And, from the time of her imprisonment, till the time that she confessed, which was some 10 or 12 days, she was not in company with the rest, nor with the guard, save 1 or 2 days, but was alone in a separate prison. And nothing to disturb her. Now, it is remarkable, that neither of these persons who were ill-used, of which Janet Corpat was none, did ever make any acknowledgment to these persons who used them ill, nor till some days after they were quite freed of this trouble. And when they did confess, it was to magistrates and minister, whom they owned to be careful to preserve them from such abuses. Nor did magistrates or minister ever use any threatening to extort a confession, or any other argument, but what the gospel requires to be made use of to bring impenitent sinners to a confession of their sins. 8. The author of the letter tells us, she was put in a low prison, out of which it was obvious that any body could make an escape, and accordingly she made her escape that night. Here are but 2 assertions, and both of them false, for the prison was the 2nd story, and her escape was by breaking an old iron grate in the window. Nor was it that night after that she broke the prison, for it was on Friday these gentlemen discoursed her, and on the Lord's Day at night she broke the prison. 9. Here follows the author of the Just Reproof's way of telling the story of the barbarous and cruel murder of Janet Corpat. She came to town under cloud of night with 2 men, and went straight to an inn where her daughter was serving. After some stay there, the 2 men brought her to the minister's house, who was visiting a sick child of one James Cook, a present bailey, where his servant came to him with Mr. Gordon's letter. And, as soon as he had perused it, he bid his servant go tell them, he would have nothing to do with her, but since they had brought her to the town, let them take her to the magistrates. Which answer, 2 men then present, have attested under their hands. On this, the men brought her to Bailey Cook's house, where the minister was, and the men meeting him coming downstairs, pressed him to take her off their hands, which he refused to do, but called the two next magistrates, and advised them instantly to set her off safe out of the town. On which the two bailies sent for their officer immediately, and the minister went off straight to his own house, and saw no appearance of a rabble, nor did hear of it, till the rabble had gone a considerable length. And after a little, he heard that the woman was got safe out of their hands, and the rabble dissipate, and he knew nothing of her death till the next morning. When the officer came to the magistrates, they, on deliberation among themselves, resolved to imprison her till the next morning, and accordingly ordered their officer to do it. And as the officer was executing the magistrates' orders, the rabble gathered upon them, attacked the officer, and took the woman from him, with which, it is said, he did not acquaint the magistrates, that they might have taken other measures for the woman's safety. This rabble did not flow from the inclinations of the people of the place, which is evident from the peaceable and safe residence two confessing witches had for 2 months' time in the place since they were set at liberty, but from an unhappy occasional concourse of a great many strangers, some Englishmen, some from Orkney, and other parts, who were forward in it, and have since taken guilt on them by their flight. As to the assertion with regard to those of Mr. Cooper's family going along with the rabble, Mr. Cooper urged to have his servants examined among the first, and they have declared before the magistrates, that they stole out in a clandestine way, that their master might not know of it, and he indeed knew nothing of it, and they returned very quickly and made no stay. Nor do any of the witnesses examined insinuate any accusation of their having the least accession to any injury she met with, nor were they any other way concerned, than by looking on a short while with some hundreds of other spectators. Again, it is said, that they first found her at Nicholas Lawson's house, and that she was killed outright when they dragged her there again, is as ill-grounded as the rest of our author's assertions. For they found her not at Nicholas Lawson's house, and some of the persons examined have declared, that after she was brought to that door, she arose and put on head clothes, and called to Nicholas Lawson to let her in. Which, if she had done, she in all appearance had met with no more disturbance, but after this, we hear that some few of the rabble stole up secretly and murdered her. The author of the second letter accuses the minister of encouraging Patrick Morton in carrying on the cheat, by reading to him the case of Barbarous' daughter. In answer to which, we shall give a short, but candid, account of matter of fact. In the month of May last, the minister, with a preacher, and a great many other people, attending all night in the room where Patrick Morton lay, and he lying meanwhile in a swooning fit, which was then tried by exquisite pinching. The minister and probationer falling into some discourse about Barbarous' daughter, took out the book, and for their own satisfaction, read only 2 sentences, and stopped. Several weeks after, when the minister was again attending in the night time, the lad being insensible, the minister, for his own diversion, read the preface, and some part of the process, against the witches, but had no reason to think he heard anything, but on the contrary. And it is to be observed, when the committee of the Privy Council did accurately examine the boy in reference to this story, he still declared he never heard anything of Barbarous' daughter's case read. What he says of their obliging them to pay £8 Scots to the town officer, is in many ways false. It is false that they were ordered by the magistrates to pay such a sum. It is false that they paid all alike. It is also untruth that any of them gave what they had provided for their winding sheets. Nicholas Lawson, one of the confessing witches, her husband voluntarily gave a small piece of unbleached linen to the officer for his fees. And this is all the ground for the story of their winding sheets. The author of the Just Reproof then proceeds to give an account of Mrs. White and Isobel Adam. The woman brought from Anstruther was a Mrs. White, an inhabitant of Pittenweem, who, through fear of being apprehended, fled thither to her daughter's house. This woman, whose cause is now warmly espoused by some, with no advantage to their reputation, and who is now insisting against the magistrates in a process for wrongous imprisonment, has been for many years a person of very bad fame. Some 18 years ago, she pursued a woman before the session, in Mr. Bruce the late episcopal incumbent's time, for calling her a witch, and succumbing in the probation. Mr. Bruce urged her to be reconciled with the woman, she obstinately refused, using most unchristian and revengeful expressions, which are to be seen in the session register. Since the Revolution, she desired admission to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, which was then denied her, because she still refused to be reconciled to that woman. Her scandalous carriage in refusing to cohabit with her husband to this day, who is a sober honest man, is generally known. This woman being accused by the boy as one of his tormentors, and delayed by 2 confessing witches, and other presumptions of her guilt, the magistrates one morning sent their officer to the magistrates of Anstruther, desiring them on these grounds to send Mrs. White to them, and the grounds of her imprisonment were sent in right to her, in her daughter Mrs. Lindsay's house. And she being brought to Pittenweem, the 2 women which delayed her, were confronted with her, in presence of the magistrates, a great many gentlemen and ministers, where they did accuse her to her face, and charged her particularly with being at a meeting in the Loan with the devil and the witches, and gave some binding tokens to convince her. By all which it appears, how little ground there is to accuse the magistrates for invading their neighbour's jurisdiction, or load the minister with any concernment in the matter. As to the other instance of one brought to Pittenweem at 6 miles distance, this was the young woman Isobel Adam. About the middle of May, one Alexander Grigor delayed her for an attempt to murder him in his own house in the night time, with several others whom he knew not. And there being some surmises of other presumptions of witchcraft against her, the minister hearing she was occasionally in the town, called for her, and advised her, before her father, if innocent, to take proper measures for her own vindication, which she undertook to do, and promised to return for that end on advertisement, which her father engaged to give. The noise about her still increasing, her father was desired, according to promise, to call her to the place, which he declined, growing jealous of her guilt. On which the minister advertised her, but in case she refused, a letter was sent to be delivered to the gentleman on whose ground she lived, desiring him to send her. So soon as the advertisement was given, she came voluntarily to her father's house in Pittenweem, and so there was no occasion for force. When she came, she confessed her converse with the devil at Thomas Adamson's house. On the 1st day of January 1704, she was confronted with Grigor, and he accused her of the above-mentioned attempt on him, which she then refused. On which she was imprisoned, and the 2 following days, she did with tears, and more than ordinary concern, make a free and large confession. She said Beatrix Lang aforesaid, a confessing witch, had been dealing with her to engage in her service, which she refused, and that some time thereafter, this Beatrix came for her, and desired her to go along to her house. When she came there, they sat down at the fire, and she saw a man in black clothes, with a hat on his head, sitting at the table, and Beatrix said to her, Since you will not engage with me, here is a gentleman that will see you. Whereupon he told her, he knew she was discontented with her lot, and if she would serve him, he promised she should want for nothing, to which she yielded to serve him, and he came forward and kissed her. And she said, he was fearsome like, and his eyes sparkled like candles, on which she knew he was the devil. Again, she told, that being employed to spin in Thomas Adamson's house in Pittenweem, while she was lying awake in her bed in the night time, the devil appearing to her, where she did expressly renounce her baptism to the devil, by putting her hand on her head, and the other to her feet, the other maid lying in the bed with her being at the time asleep, as the maid declared before the session. About a fortnight after this, Beatrix Lang came to visit her, and asked her, if she had met with the gentleman. She answered she had, and also engaged with him, on which Beatrix said, I have then got my work wrought, and went away. And she confessed, she came to that meeting at Grigoress with the devil and several witches, viz. Beatrix Lang, Nicholas Lawson, Janet Corp Hat, Thomas Brown, and several others she knew not, designing to murder Grigor. But since the man awakened and prayed to God for himself, they could not do it. She confessed also converse with the devil at other times. All which is in her 2 confessions, signed by the magistrates, and transmitted to Edinburgh. Now, we desire to know what the author of this letter can quarrel in the magistrates' or ministers' conduct in this matter. As for what he says about the magistrates and minister refounded the imprisoned women's money 7-fold. We find this author very charitable on other men's purses, but when the magistrates and minister design to bestow their charity, they will choose more deserving objects. And the lords of her majesty's privy council understands themselves better than to take their measures as to what is just from the daring prescriptions of this author. What he says about Thomas Brown is also false. He was accused by the lad, and delayed by 3 confessing witches, as being accessory to the attempt on Grigor. It is false he was starved, for his daughter brought him his diets punctually. Our author's fears of more murders are altogether groundless, and we appeal to all men of candor, whether this author's impudent and unjust accusation against magistrates and minister of murdering Thomas Brown deserves not severer punishment than anything he can charge them with. He again tells us, the Baileys justified the murder, by denying Christian burial. The Baileys gave no order thereabout. As for Thomas Brown, his son-in-law, with some others, buried him. Our author by his next may prove, that Janet Corp had, a woman that had so frequently and so solemnly confessed the renunciation of her baptism to the devil, deserved Christian burial. The end. A copy of the indictment of the witches at Borrowstouness. The precept for summoning the jury and witnesses, with the warrant for their execution. Copy of the indictment. Annabel Thomson, widow in Borrowstouness. Margaret Pringle, relict of the deceased John Campbell Sivrite there, and ye, and Ilkane of Yao ar indicted and accused, that where, notwithstanding, be the law of God, particularly set down in the 20 chapter of Leviticus, and 18 chap. of Deuteronomy, and be the laws and acts of Parliament of this kingdom, and constant practic, thereof, particularly be the 73 Act, 29 Parliament Q. Marie, the crime of witchcraft is declared to be an horrid, abominable and capital crime, punishable with the pains of death and confiscation of movables. Nevertheless it is a verity, that you have committed, and are guilty of the said crime of witchcraft, in swa far ye have entered in paction with the devil, the enemy of your salvation, and have renounced at our blessed Lord and Saviour. And your baptism, and have given yourselves, both soulless and bodies to the devil, and have been several meetings with the devil, and sundry white witches in diverse places. And particularly, ye the said Annabel Thomson had a meeting with the devil the time of your widowhood, before Yao was married to your last husband, in your cooming betwixt Linlithgow and Borrowstouness, where the devil, in the lickneys of ane black man, told Yao, that you was ane poor puddled bodie, and had ane evil life, and difficulty to win through the world. And promised, if ye wold follow him, and go alongst with him, Yao should never want, but have ane better life. And, about 5 weeks thereafter, the devil appeared to Yao when Yao was going to the coal hill about 7 o'clock in the morning. Having renewed his former temptation, you did condescend thereto, and declared yourself content to follow him, and become his servant, whereon the devil threw Yao to the ground, and had carnal copulation with Yao. And ye, and each person of Yao, was at several meetings with the devil in the links of Borrowstouness, and in the house of Yao Bessie Vicar, and ye did eat and drink with the devil, and with on another. And with witches in here house in the night time. And the devil and the said W.M. Craw brought the ale which he drank, extending to about 7 gallons, from the house of Elizabeth Hamilton. And Yao the said Annabel had an other meeting about 5 weeks ago, when you was going to the coal hill of Grange, and he invaded Yao to go alongiest and drink with him in the Grange pans. And Yao the said Margaret Pringle have been ane which there many year as bygane, hath renounced your baptism, and become the devil's servant, and promised to follow him. And the devil had carnal copulation with Yao, and took you by the right hand, whereby it was, for 8 days, grievously pained. But having it twitched of new again, it immediately became hale, and Yao the said Margaret Hamilton has been the devil's servant these 8 or 9 years bygane. And he appeared and conversed with Yao at the Tune Well of Borrowstouness, and several times in your Awin house, and drank several chop-pens of ale with you, and thereafter had carnal copulation with Yao. And the devil gave Yao ane 5 merk pace of gold, whilk a little efter became ane sklate stone. And Yao the said Margaret Hamilton, relict of James Polwart, has been ane witch, and the devil's servant 30 years since, hath renounced your baptism as said is, and has had carnal copulation with the devil in the lickneys of ane man. But he removed from Yao in the lickneys of ane black dowg, and ye, and Ilkane of Yowis at ein meeting with the devil and wither witches at the Croce of Muirstane above Kincaid, upon the 13th of October last, where Yow all danced. And the devil acted the piper, and where Yow endeavoured to have destroyed Enro Mitchell, sown to John Mitchell, elder in Dean of Kinneil. Precept Craw Witches, and the Witnesses and Assayissers, 1679. Cochrane of Barbaclay, Richard Elphinstown of Sainlands of Hilderstown, Cornwall of Bonhard, Robert Hamilton of Deckmont, Balesy of the Regality of Borrowstouness, Sir John Harper Advocat, Mr. William Dundas. And Mr. John Prestown Advocats, Commissioners of Justiciary, Speciali Constitut, Nominat, and appointed by the Lords of His Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council for the trial and judging of the persons after nomit. To our Lovets, Messengers, Macers, and Officers of Cart, or Sheriffs in that part, conjunctly and severally, Speciali Constitut. Grading, for semikillies the day of, is appointed by W.S. for the trying and judging of Annabel Thompson widow in Borrowstouness, Margaret Pringle relict of the deceased John Campbell Sivwright there. Margaret Hamilton relict of the deceased James Polwart there, W.M. Craw and Dweller there, Bessie Vicar relict of the deceased James Penny and Dweller there, and Margaret Hamilton relict of the deceased Thomas Mitchell, who are apprehended and imprisoned in the Tolbooth of Borrowstouness. As suspect guilty of the abominable crime of witchcraft, by entering into pactioun with the devil, renouncing their baptism and committing of maleficies, wherefore necessary it is that the said's persons should be summoned dead to wonderlie the law for the samen, and that witness and assessors should be cited against them, to the effect, and under the pains after specify it. Herefore, this precept saying, we charge you passe, and in our sovereign Lord's name and authority, and ours, command and charge the said's persons above complained upon, to compure before W.S. or any three of us, who are by our said commission declared to be a quorum, within the said Tolbooth of Borrowstouness, the 19th day of December next, in the hour of cause, there to wonderlie the law, for the crimes above specify it. And that under the pains contained in the new Acts of Parliament, and cycliac, summon, wherein and charge an assize of honest and famous persons, not exceeding the number of 45. Together with such witnesses who best know the verity of the persons above complained upon the guiltines, to compure before us, day and place foresaid, in the hour of cause, the persons of 10 witness. To bear leal and soothfast witnessing in the premise, and the inquest to passe upon the assize each person, under the pain of 100 merks, according to justice, ace you will answer to us thereupon, the whilk to do commits to you. Conjunctly and severally, our FWLL power, be thur our letra, delivering them be you dully execute and endorse it again to the Byra. Given under our hands at Borrowstouness, the 21st day of November, 1679 years. 6 Subscriber. R. Hamilton. J. Cornwall. Rich. Elphinstone. W. Dundas. Ein list of the persons to be warned to passe upon the assize for judging the witches in Borrowstouness. Barony of Caradon. Robert Ballenden Elder in Northbank. Alex. Brown in Bonhard. John Irwine there. James Lamb there. George Story in Muiredge. Thomas Knox Wyver in Little Caradon. John Meldrum there. George Young in Murray's. John Brown Oversman there. George Smith there. John Roberts one in Bonhard Pans. John Davies one there. John Poole there. Town of Borrowstouness. George Bennett. James Castles Elder, Skipper. Alex. Drysdale Skipper. James Hardy Glover. Alex. Randy Baxter. Richard Carse. James Hamilton Elder. James Hutton Baxter. Andrew Hamilton. Thomas Downey. James Mungill Wyver. Rob. Downey. Barony of Kinneil. George Gibb in Kinneil Carse. Alex. Gibb in Innerhaven. John Glenn there. John Baird there. James Dobby in Nether Kinneil. Patrick Hardy there. John Dick in Woodhade. John Wilson in Overcanile. James Thompson there. James Lithgow in Balderstown. John Hardy, Maltman in Borrowstown. James Thompson there. Barony of Polmont. James Byrne of Clerkstown. James Monteth of Myln Hall. Alex White in Hill. Patrick Ballenden of Park End. John Marshall in Whiteside. Andrew Johnstown in Polmont. David Ballenden in Reading. James Gaff there. George Muirhead there. William Ruchat of Rushall. John Grintown in Gillstown Lonefoot. Henry Taylor in Whiteside. John Purgott of Bruchtown Crag. Order and Warrant for burning the witches of Borrowstouness, December 19, 1679. Forsemichael as Annabel Thompson widow in Borrowstouness, Margaret Pringle relict of the Deckeast John Campbell there, Margaret Hamiltown relict of the Deckeast James Polwart there, William Craw indweller there. Bessie Wicker relict of the Deckeast James Penny there, and Margaret Hamiltown relict of the Deckeast Thomas Mitchell there, prisoners in the Tolbooth of Borrowstouness, are found guilty be an assize. Of the abominable crime of witchcraft committed be them, in manner mentioned in their dictates. And are discerned and adjudged be us under subscribers, commissioners of justiciary specially appointed to this effect, to be taken to the west end of Borrowstouness, the ordinary place of execution there. Upon Tuesday the 23rd day of December current, betwixt 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they're to be worried at a stake till they be dead, and thereafter to have their bodies burnt to ashes. These therefore require and command the Baillie Principal off the regality of Borrowstouness, and his deputs, to see the said sentence and doom put to do execution in all points, as ye will be answerable. Given under our hands at Borrowstouness the 19th day of December 1679 years. W. Dundas. Rich. Elphinstone. Wa. Sandilands. J. Cornwall. J. Hamilton. Trial of Isobel Elliot, and 9 other women. Records of Justiciary, September 13, 1678. In 1678, Isobel Elliot and 9 other women were tried for witchcraft in one day. The articles of indictment against all of them were pretty much the same. Those exhibited against Isobel Elliot were as follows: that about 2 years ago she stayed at home from the kirk at the desire of her mistress, who was a witch, when the devil had a meeting with the prisoner, her mistress, and 2 other witches. That he kissed the prisoner, baptized her on the face with an waff of his hand like a doing, and offered to lie with her, but forbore because she was with child, that after she was kirked the devil often met her, and had carnal copulation with her. The prisoner and the other 9 miserable women underwent all the legal forms incident to their unhappy situation among that deluded and barbarous people. They had been prosecuted by His Majesty's advocate. They judicially acknowledged their guilt, were convicted by the jury, condemned by the judges, and burned by the executioner, for having had carnal copulation with the devil. The Confessions of Helen Taylor. In Eyemouth, and Menie Haliburtoun in Durlton, accused of witchcraft, 1649. With the declaration of John Kincaid, pricker. Copied from the originals. The Confession of Helene Talesier. July 8, 1649. Being the Sabbath day, Mr. Samuel Douglas, preaching at Eyemouth, after sermon, Helen Talesier desired to speak with the said Mr. Samuel, who coming to hear, there being also present Samuel Lauder and George Halliday. She confessed these particulars, viz. First, at Candlemas bygone 2 years, Sco came into Isobel Brown's house, where the Deville was sitting in the lickneys of a gentle man at the table drinking with Isobel Brown, who took her in his arms without any moyer spiking at that time. Second lie, Sco declares, that after she came to Isobel Brown's house where the Deville was in the same likeness as before, and laid his hand upon her head, and said, "You sall be on of mine so long as you live." And that he gave her $2, and when she came home they wer but twa stains. Third lie, she declares, that she was at ane mating with Isobel Brown, Alison Cairns, Margaret Dobson, and Beatrix Young, and that tie went all along to William Burnett's house, he lying sick, and that coming to the house. Margaret Dobson was in the lickneys of ane black hen, and went in at the chimley head, and Beatrix Young in the lickneys of a little foal, and that herself was in the lickneys of ane little whelp. Isobel Brown wes in her owen lickneys, with a long-tailed court shaw upon her head, and Alison Cairns wes in her owen lickneys. And that Isobel Brown desired her to go into William Burnett's, but she refused, whereupon Isobel Brown did strike her on the back. Fourthly, she declares that Marianne Robison wes ane witch, and that she was William Burnet's death. Signed, Mr. Samuel Douglas, Minister. At Coldinghame. S. Lauder. G. Halliday. The Deposition of Menie Haliburtoun. At Durltown, June, 1649. Comparet Menie Haliburtoun, prisoner within the castle, suspect of the crime of witchcraft, delated guilty be Agnes Clerk's son, less suffer for the said crime. As also be Patrick Watsoun, spouse to the said Menie, who likewise suffereth therefore, and confess it, that octine year sign, or the Irby, here doctor being seek, Sco first sent for Patrick Christison in a Burldy, to come and cure here doctor. And he refusing, went herself for him, who refused to cure here. And within days after came the devil in lickneys of a man into her house, calling himself a physician, and said to her, that he had good salves, and namely oilesbeck, wherewith he would cure here doctor. And agreeing with him for some of his salves whilk he gave here, she gave him 2 English shillings. He then departed, and promised to come again within 8 days, whilk accordingly he did, but or he went away the first time, she gave him milk and bread, and Patrick Watsoun coming in, he sent for a pewint of ale. But at his second coming he stayed all night, and upon the morn early, Patrick being firth, in cam the devil and lay down with here, Sco being yet in bed, and had carnal copulation with here, his nature being called. He desired here to renounce Christ and here baptism, and become his servant, whilk Sco did. And sighs, that here doctor had the white of all here wicked wissing, and wissing she had never been born. This deposition was renewed in all the particulars by the said Menie, in the foresaid place, on Sunday the 1st of July, 1649, before Alexander Levingston of Saltcoats, James Borthwick Chamberlain, James Lauder, John Stalker Bailey, W.M. Dalzell, and Mr. John Emgee, Minister at Durltown. Signed, J. Macgee. Alex. Livingstone, Witness. Ja. Borthwick. James Lauder. John Stalker. W. Dalzell. Walter Marshall. The Declaration of John Kincaid. June, 1649. The whilk day, in presence of Alex. Levingston of Saltcoatis, James Borthwick Chamberlain of Durltown, John Stalker Bailey Theroff, James Foreman in Drem, Mr. James Achiason in North Berwick, and William Dalzell Noter, Patrick Watson in West Fenton, and Menie Haliburtoun his spouse. Brooded and long suspect of witchcraft, of their win free will uncompel it, erring that first John Kincaid under subscribend Wes in the town of Durltown. And had some skill and dexterity in trying of the devilis mark in the personies of such as wer suspect to be witches, came to the broad hall in the castell of Durltown. And desired me the said John Kincaid to use my trial of thame as I had done on Euthyrus, whilk when I had done, I found the devilis mark upon the box side of the said Patrick Watsoun, a little under the point of his left shoulder. And upon the left side of the said Menie Haliburtoun her neck a little above her left shoulder, whereof they wer not sensible, neither cam forth thereof any blood after I had tried the semine as exactly as ever I did any Euthers. This I testify to be a verity upon my credit and conscience. In Wittens Queref, I have subscribit their presentis with my hand, day, and place for said, before their witnesses above specify it. J. K. Alex. Livingstone, Witness. Ja. Borthwick, Witness. John Stalker, Witness. James Foreman, Witness. Ja. X1, Witness. W. Dalzell, Witness. The trial of William Coke and Alison Dick, for witchcraft. Extracted from the minutes of the Kirk session of Kirkcaldy, d. 1636. September 6, 1633. The which day, compeered Alison Dick, challenged upon some speeches uttered by her against William Coke, tending to witchcraft, denied the salmon. 1. Compeered Alexander Savage, Andrew Nichol, and George Tilley, who being admitted and sworn, deponed as follows, the said Alexander Savage, that he heard the said Alison Dick say to her husband William Coke, Thou hast put down many ships. It had been good for the people of Kirkcaldy, that they had knit a stone about thy neck and drowned thee. 2. Andrew Nichol deponed, that he heard the said Alison say to him, Thou hast gotten the woman's song laid, as thou promised. Thou art over long living, it had been good for the women of Kirkcaldy, that thou had been dead long since. I shall cause all the world wonder upon thee. 3. George Tilley deponed, that he heard her say to him, It had been good for the women of Kirkcaldy, to put him to death, and that he had died 7 years since. Also compeered Jean Adamson, Catherine Spens, Marion Meeson, Isobel Murison, Alison Kellock, who being admitted and sworn, deponed as follows. 4. Jean Adamson deponed, that she heard Alison Dick say to her husband William Coke, Thief! Thief! What is this that I have been doing? Keeping the thready years from meekle evil doing. Many pretty men has thou put 10 down both in ships and boats, thou hast gotten the woman's song laid now. Let honest men puddle and work as they like, if they please not thee well, they shall not have meekle to the fore when they die. 5. Catherine Spens deponed, that she heard her say to him, Common thief, I have hindered thee from many ill turns doing, both to ships and boats. 6. Marion Meeson deponed, that she heard her say, Common thief, mony ill turn have I hindered thee from doing thready years, mony ships and boats hast thou put down, and when I would have holden the string to have saved one man, thou wold not. 7. Isobel Murison deponed, that she heard her say to him, Thief, thief, I have kept thee from doing many ill turns. Thou hast now laid the woman's song. September 24, 1633. 8. Compeered Janet Allen, relict of Uncle John Duncan Fisher, deponed, that Alison Dick came in upon a certain time to her house, when she was lying in of a bairn, and craved some sour bakes. And she denying to give her any, the said Alison said, Your bairns shall beg yet, as they do. And her husband being angry at her, reproved her, and she abused him in language, and when he struck her, she said, that she should cause him ruit. And she hoped to see the powarts big in his hair, and within half a year he was casten away, and his boat, and perished. 9. Janet Saunders, daughter-in-law to the said William Coke and Alison Dick, deponed, that William Coke came in to her, and she being weeping, he demanded the cause of it, she answered, it was for her husband. The said William said, What ails thee? Thou wilt get thy Gudman again, but ye will get him both naked and bare, and whereas there was no word of him for a long time before, he came home within 2 days thereafter, naked and bare as he said, the ship wherein he was being casten away. 4. 10. Jean Adamson deponed, that when her Gudman sailed with David Robertson, the said David having sent him home with a ship to come for Scotland, there was a long time that there was no word of that ship. So that David Robertson coming home, and the other ship not come, nor no word from her, he said he would never see her. The said Alison Dick came in to her, she with her bairns being weeping, and said, What ails ye Jean to weep? She answered, We have all good cause to weep for my husband, whom we will never see more. The said Alison said, Hold your tongue, your Gudman and all the company are well enough. They are in Norway loading their ship with timber to come home, they will be here shortly. And so it fell out in every point as she said. 5. 11. Catherine Spens deponed, that William Coke came in to her, after that his wife had spoken so much evil to him, and said, Catherine, my wife has spoken meekle ill of me this day, but I said nothing to her again. If I had spoken 2 words to her the last time she was in the steeple, she would never have gotten out of it. Minutes of September 24th, ordains Mr. James Miller to ride to Preston for the man that tries the witches. The expense to be paid by the town and session. September 8. 12. Compared Isobel Hay, spouse to Alexander Law, against Alison Dick, who being sworn, deponed, that she having come into her house, her husband being newly sailed, she craved some money of her, which she refused, and boasted her. The said Alison said, it shall gang where geets, and that same voyage, her husband had great loss. And thereafter, the said Alison came into her house, she being Firth, and took her sister by the hand, and since that time, the maiden had never been in her right wits. 13. William Burvey declared, that Robert Whyt having once stricken William Coke, Alison Dick his wife, came to the said Robert, and said, Wherefore have ye stricken my husband? I shall cause you rue it. The said Robert replying, What sayest thou? I shall give you as much, you witch. She answered, Witches take the wit and the grace from you, and that same night, he was bereft of his wits. 14. Janet Whyt, daughter to the said Robert, comparing, affirmed the said divinity to be true upon her oath. And added, that she went to the said Alison, and reproved her, laying the wit of her father's sickness upon her. Let him pay me then, and he will be better, but if he pay me not, he will be worse, for there is none that does me wrong, but I go to my God and complains upon them, and within 24 hours I will get amends of them. The said Janet Whyt declared, that Alison Dick said to her servant, Agnes Fairley, I have gotten a grip of your godwife's thigh, I shall get a grip of her leg next. The said Janet having burnt her thigh before with lint, and thereafter she has taken such a pain in her leg, that she can get no remedy for it. Whilk the said Agnes Fairley deponed upon her great oath to be true. 15. Alison Dick herself declared, that David Patterson, skipper, having struck William Coke her husband, and drawn him by the feet, and compelled him to bear his gear aboard, the said William cursed the said David. And that voyage he was taken by the Dunkirkers. Also, at another time thereafter, he compelled him to bear his gear aboard, and a captain's who was with him, and when the captain would have paid him, the said David would not suffer him, but he himself gave him what he liked. The said William cursed the said David very vehemently, and at that time he himself perished, his ship, and all his company, except 2 or 3. Also she declared, that when his own son sailed in David Whyt's ship, and gave not his father his bon alley 11 the said William said, What? Is he sailed, and given me nothing? The devil be with him. If ever he come home again, he shall come home naked and bare, and so it fell out. For John Whyt, who had that ship freighted to Norway, and another wherein himself was, declared, that they had very foul weather. And the ship wherein the said young William Coke was, perished, and he saved all the men in the ship wherein he was himself. And albeit the storm increased 2 days before the perishing of the said ship, and 6 days after, yet the 2 hours space in which they were saving the men, it was so calm in that part of the sea, that they rowed from one ship to the other with 2 oars, and the sea was all troublesome about them. And the said William Coke the younger, was the first man that came a shipboard. Packed I on dot, the same day, Alison Dick being demanded by Mr. James Simpson, minister, when, and how, she fell in covenant with the devil. She answered, her husband mony times urged her, and she yielded only 2 or 3 years since. The manner was thus, he gave her, soul and body, quick and quitterer full to the devil, and bade her do so. But she in her heart said, God guide me. And then she said to him, I shall do anything that ye bid me, and so she gave herself to the devil in the foresaid words. This she confessed about 4 hours even, freely, without compulsion, before Mr. James Simpson, minister, William Tennant, Bailey, Robert French, town clerk, Mr. John Malcolm, schoolmaster, William Craig, and me, the said Mr. James Miller. Writer hereof. October 15th. 16. The which day, compared Christian Ronaldson, against Alison Dick, who, in her presence being sworn, deponed, that she having set an house to the said Alison, and when the goodman came home he was angry, and said, he would not have the devil to dwell above him in the closs. And he went and struck up the door, and put forth the chimney that she put in it. And thereafter, Alison came to the said Christian, and chopped upon her shoulder, and said to her, Christy, your Gudman is going to sail, and he has ane stock among his hands, but ere long, his stock shall be as short as mine. And so it fell out, for he was casten away in David Whyt's ship, and saved nothing. October 22 d. 17. Compared Marjorie Marshall, against Alison Dick, who being sworn, deponed, that Alison having brought her Gudman's clothes once from the Castle Haven 12 she offered her 12d for her labour, who would not have it. And she said to her, Alison, there is not many of them. She answered, they shall be fewer the next time, and the next voyage he was cast away in David Whyt's ship. 18. Compared also Catherine Wilson, who being sworn, deponed, that she and Janet Whyt being sliding together, Alison Dick came to them, and asked silver from Janet Whyt, who would give her none, but fled her company into the said Catherine's house. And she followed, and she gave her a piece bread, and Janet Whyt bade her give her a plaque also, and she should pay her again. And when she got it, she said, Is this all that she gives me? If she had given me a groat, it would have vantaged her 1,000 punds. This is your doing, evil tidings come upon you. And she went down the closs, and pissed at their meal cellar door, and after that, they had never meal in that cellar, they being meal makers. And thereafter they bought a horse at 40 lib. And the horse never carried a load to them but 2, but died in the baths, looping to death, so that every body said that he was witched. October 29. 19. Euphane Boswell being sworn, deponed, that her Gudman being to sail to the east country, loaden with salt, the said Alison Dick having borne some of the salt aboard, she came to her and craved money from her, who gave her meat. But would give her no money, saying to her, Alison, my Gudman has paid you himself, and therefore, I will give you nothing. She replied, Will ye give me nothing? I hope in God it will be better sharp, cheaper, sold nor it was bought, and so it fell out, for the ship sailed upon the morn, and the day after that, she sank, salt and all, except the men, who were saved by another ship that was near by them. 20. Thomas Mustard being sworn, deponed, that James Wilson going once to sail, Alison Dick came to him, and desired silver from him, he would give her none, she abused him with language, and he struck her. She said to him, that hand should do him little good that voyage, and within 2 days after, his hand swelled as great as a pint stoop, so that he could get little or nothing done with it. The next time also when he was to sail, the said Alison went betwixt him and the boat, and he said, Yon same witch thief is going betwixt me and the boat, I must have blood of her. And he went and struck her, and bled her, and she cursed him and banned him, and that same voyage, he being in Caithness, standing upon the shore cliving a toe, and a boy with him, the sea came and took him away, and he died. And the boy was well enough. Desires Mr. Robert Douglas 13 to go to the Archbishop with this process, to get his approbation thereto, who takes upon him to do the same. Minute of November 19. 5s. Given for a load of coals to Alison Dick. 14ths. For her entertainment this week bygone, being this day, with her husband William Coke, burnt for witchcraft. In the minute of December 17th, there is a particular account of the town and session's extraordinary disbursements for William Coke and Alison Dick, witches. In premies. To Mr. James Miller, when he went to Presstown for a man to try them, 47s. £2 7. Item. To the man of Culross, the executioner, when he went away the first time, 12s. 012. Item. For coals for the witches, 24s. 14. Item. In purchasing the commission, 9-3. Item. For one to go to Finmouth for the laird to sit upon their assize as judge, 06. Item. For Harden to be jumps to them, 310. Item. For making of them, 08. Summa for the Kirk's part £17 1 Scots. The town's part of expenses burst extraordinarily upon William Coke and Alison Dick. In primis, for 10 loads of coals to burn them, 5 merks, £3 6/8. Item. For a tar barrel, 14s. 0 Item. For tows, 0 Item. To him that brought the executioner, 2 Item. To the executioner for his pains, 8 Item. For his expenses here, 0 Item. For one to go to Finmouth for the laird, 0 Summa Town's part, £17 10 Scots. Both, 34 The following account is a voucher of a payment made by Alexander Loudon, a factor on the estate of Burn Castle, the proprietor being then a minor and infant. It is entered in the factor's books thus. Mayor for Margaret Dunholm the Times Ski was in prison, and was put to death, 065, 14, 4. Count Giffen out be Alexander Loudon in Lilstown, in ye year of God 1649 yearies, for Margaret Dalmoun in Burncastle. Item, in ye first, to W.M. Curry and Andrew Gray for the watching of here ye space of 30 days, in ilk day, XXXSH in XLV lib Scots. Item Mayor to John Kincaid. For brooding of her 14, 6 lib Scots. Mayor for meat and drink and wine to him and his man, Theage lib Scots. Mayor for cloth to hear, IIJ lib Scots. Mayor for TWA Ter Trice, XLSH Scots. Item Mayor for TWA Trice. And ye making of them to the workmen, IIJ lib Scots. Item to ye hangman in Hatingtown, and fetchin of him, $3 for his pens. Is, Theage lib 8sh. Item Mayor for might and drink and wine for his intertinge, 3 lib Scots. Item Mayor fair ain man and TWA horse, for ye fetching of him, and taking of him hame again, XLSH Scots. Mayor to hear for might and drink ilkane day. Theage sh the space of XXX days, is, 6 lib Scots. Item Mayor to ye TWA officers for year fi ilk day 6 shilling odd pennies, is, X lib Scots. Summa is, Theage Scoyer 12 lib zsh. Gilbert Lauder. Lauder Bilzors. Talking of this above written some 27 pundis Scoties qlk the said Uncle Margaret Dinham had of her ein. 92, 14, 27, 65, 14. Minutes and Proceedings of the Session of Torryburn, in Fifeshire concerning Witchcraft. With the confession of Lilia's Audi. Taken from the Session Records. Minutes, and Torry, June 30, 1704. Sedirant, W.M. Hutton, W.M. Dalglish, W.M. Reed, John Mitchell, David Curry, G.O. Tilloch, with the minister. The session being called, pro re nata, upon a flagrant rumor, that Jean Bizet, wife to James Tanneky, had been molested by Satan, and had complained of some particular person of the devil's instruments in that trouble that she lay under. Whereupon the minister ordered the officer to cite the said Jean Bizet, also Lilia's Audi and Janet White, whom she was said to complain of, and also to cite Mary Wilson, who is said to have taken the charm by stroking up her head. And also, he ordered the officer to cite Tanneky's daughter, with James Tanneky, James White and his wife, Helen Anderson, and Mary Nielsen, who are said to know something of the circumstances of that affair. 1 Mo, Jean Bizet being called, compeered not, upon which the officer is ordered to cite her to the next. 2 Do, there being a public report that Janet White should have threatened James Tanneky's family with a mischief, but particularly his wife, before this befell. The said Janet was called, and interrogate, if ever she threatened James Tanneky's wife, she declares, that she never threatened any such thing, nor thought so. Moreover, she said, that James his wife would not say so, otherwise she would lay down her head upon a scaffold. She said, that she was not at her since she took that distemper, and saw her not since, but saw her on the Monday before, and her husband's daughter, and Jean Archibald in Culross, but upon the morrow the woman was troubled. James White being called, declared, that Jean Bizet was in a distemper upon Tuesday the 13th day of June, in Helen Anderson's house, betwixt 9 and 10 at night, and seemed drunk. 3to, that she drank not a gill in that house, but before she came to Helen's house, she was about half an hour in Mary Wilson's. 4to, she seemed to be strangely distempered, and he heard her say, Agnes, beware lest Lilia's 80 come upon you and your child. 2d, she said to Mary Nielsen, Lilia's 80 thinks to use me as she used your sister. 3to, she complained upon Mary Wilson, but none saw the said Mary. As she went home, she cried, Now, Jenny, I'll be felled now, there 3 blue doublets, frequently, and wringing her hands. Note, she got a considerable sleep in Helen Anderson's. 5to, as she went home, he had let her go, and she not only went freely, but did run violently, without stumbling in the least, the breadth of Torrey Park, and he had difficulty to overtake her. Notwithstanding there was both a dyke and furrows in the way. 6to, he declared, that he heard that the next day she was no better. 7 no, he declared, that on the Monday before, Janet White said to him, before James Alexander in Drumfin, that she would make Jean Bizet forethink what she had done to her in not paying her 2 barrels of ale which she sold her. On this purpose she could not get the maltman paid. 3to, Helen Anderson being called, declared, that Jean Bizet was in her house, out of Mary Wilson's, about 5 or 6 at night the foresaid day, and she seemed to be strangely distempered. 2 delay, her eyes raised, and could drink none. 3to, a tear she had slept from 6 to near 9, and when she awaked, she cried, By God he is going to take me. By Christ he is going to take me. O Lily with her blue doublet. O Mary, Mary Wilson. Repeating Christ keep me. Upon which Helen said to her husband, Did you ever see her in this condition? He answered, Never in my life, but she is too much taken up with that company, but let me to her, I shall ding the devil out of her. For this she appeals to James Tanaki and his son, she and James White declares both, that they are clear to depone the same. Agnes Henderson, wife to James White, called, compared, declared, that she was sent for to James Tanaki's wife the day foresaid, who was in a great trouble, and never saw her in the like. 2d, that she slept a while, and when she awoke, she cried, O God! O Christ! There is Lily coming to take me, and 3 blue doublets. O Mary Wilson keep me, she is coming. She adds, that Jean was in Mary Wilson's before she came to Helen Anderson's, and she said, that she desired her to go home, for Lily will take you and the child both. She heard her say to Mary Wilson, It was not to you that she did evil, but to your sister, what aileth her at me, I never did her any ill. And as she went home, she seemed raised, but went and spake very well, and she went with her, she heard her speak often of Lily by the way, that she was coming to take her. And she adds, that as she came first into the Numiln, that she looked and spoke as heartsomely as ever she saw her, and seemed no way disordered, and having carried one of James White's children from the Numiln to James's house. And, on the next day, being Wednesday, she went to see how she was, and found her complaining of a sore head, and in a sweat, and she seemed not right, and she says, she is clear to depone what she has declared. Mary Nielsen being called in, said, that when Jean Bizet came to her mistress Helen Anderson her house, she was not within, but she was within when she awoke out of her sleep. 2d, she heard her say, O God! O Christ Jesus keep me. 3to, she heard her say, O keep me. Keep me. There she is coming, Lily 80 with her blue doublet. 4to, O Mary Wilson. O Mary Wilson. 5to, she said, as she went away out of the house, she did no ill to you, but to your sister. She is clear to depone all this. Jean Bizet being called in, declares, that on the foresaid Tuesday, she came to the Numiln in the forenoon, carrying James White's son on her back from the Craigmiln, and James White was with her. 2d, she came first to Helen Anderson her house, and her husband being upon business, she went to Helen Tillock her house. 3to, she went to Mary Wilson's house, where Lot Nicol, with Isobel Harley, were drinking in the room next to the door, and she went by them to the room, where Mary Wilson filled a pint of ale and desired her to drink of it. She took a drink, but did not drink beyond a gill of it, and Helen Tilloch, and Jean Tilloch, came in and drank the rest, with many others. For too, she could scarcely have been a quarter of an hour there, and that she returned to Helen Anderson her house immediately. Mary Wilson called, said, when Jean Bizet came to her house, she called for a choppin of ale, and stayed until that was drunk, and another was filled, and a part of that was drunk. 2d, there was none but Helen Tilloch and Jean Bizet, and herself, at the drinking of that ale. 3to, Euphon Nicol came in, and she took a drink of it. 4to, she declares, that Jean Tilloch was not within the door then. 5to, Robert Nicol and Catherine Mitchell, and Margaret Nicol, sister to Robert Nicol, were drinking at the fireside. 6to, she declares, that she seemed no ways disordered with drink, nor any other way. 7 no, she went up to her on Thursday afternoon, and she found her lying on her bed, and straked her head, and whether she was immediately the better of it, or not, she knew not, but she left her sitting at the fireside with her child on her knee. Jean Bizet says, Jean Tilloch was really there. 2d, she says it was Friday afternoon before she settled. Torryburn, July 29, 1704. After prayer, sederant, minister, and elders. Lilia's Audi being accused of witchcraft by Jean Nielsen, who is dreadfully tormented, the said Lilias was incarcerate by Bailey Williamson about 10 of the night upon the 28th of July. Lilias being exhorted to declare the truth, and nothing but truth, she replied, what I am to say shall be as true as the sun is in the firmament. Being interrogate if she was in compact with the devil, she replied, I am in compact with the devil, and have been so since before the second burning of the witches in this place. She further declared, that the first time she met with the devil was at the Gaulet, between Torryburn and New Milne, in the harvest, before the sun set, where he tryst to meet her the day after, which tryst she kept. And the devil took her to a stook side, and caused her renounce her baptism. The ceremony he used was, he put one hand on the crown of her head, and the other on the soles of her feet, with her own consent, and caused her say all was the devil's betwixt the crown of her head and the soles of her feet. And there the devil lay with her carnally, and that his skin was cold, and his colour black and pale, he had a hat on his head, and his feet was cloven like the feet of a stirk, as she observed when he went from her. The next time she saw him was at a meeting at the Barn Rods, to which she was summoned by Grisel Anderson in New Milne, about Martinmas. Their number was about 20 or 30, whereof none are now living but herself. She adds, it was a moonlight night, and they danced some time before the devil came on a pony, with a hat on his head, and they clapped their hands and cried, there are Prince, with whom they danced about an hour. The next time was at a meeting at the back of Patrick Sands's house, in Valleyfield, where the devil came with a cap which covered his ears and neck. They had no moonlight. Being interrogate if they had any light, she replied, she got light from darkness, and could not tell what that light was, but she heard them say it came from darkness, and went to darkness, and said, it is not so bright as a candle. The low thereof being blue, yet it gave such a light as they could discern others' faces. There they abode about an hour, and danced as formerly. She knew none at the meeting but Elspeth Williamson, whom she saw at the close of the meeting coming down by the dyke side. And she said, she was also at another meeting in the Haugh of Torry, where they were furnished with the former light, and she saw Elspeth Williamson there also. July 31st, 1704. After prayer, sederant, minister, and elders. Lilia's Audi adhered to her former confession, and added, there were many meetings she was not witness to, and was at many of which she could give no particular account, and you will get more news after this. Being interrogate if she knew any more witches in the place, she replied, Agnes Curry is a witch, but she is a bold woman, and will flee upon me if I should delate her. Being interrogate if the devil had a sword, she replied, she believed he durst not use a sword, and called him a villain that promised her many good things when she engaged with him, but never gave her anything but misery and poverty. The last meeting ever she was at, was 14 days after the sacrament, in the month of August 1701, upon the minister's glebe where the tent stood. Their number was 16 or 18, whereof Agnes Curry was one. She added, that she made an apology to the meeting, because she could not wait upon them all the time, being obliged to go to Borrowstouness that morning's tide. She added, that she heard Jean Nielsen was possessed with a devil, and troubled with a fit of distemper, but declared she never wronged her, though the devil may do it in her likeness. Elspeth Williamson being called, came into the prison where the session sate, and being interrogate if Lilia's Audi had any envy at her, she answered, she knew no envy she had at her. Lilia's being interrogate if Elspeth Williamson was guilty of witchcraft, she replied, she is as guilty as I am, and my guilt is as sure as God is in heaven. The next time she saw the devil was about half a year ago, as she went to Culross. She saw him at the west end of the coalfold. Upon the affair of Janet White, James Alexander being called, compeered, and declared that he never heard Janet White threaten Jean Bizet in the least. James White called, declared ut ante, but adds, that upon Friday was 8 days, the 21st of July, he heard a great screeching when he was in the Craig Milne upon the bleaching green, beneath the said milne. And heard a second screech much greater, and clapping of hands and laughing, about 12 of the night, in the green on the other side of the burn. And it was observed by the bleachers to be all pastured, though there was no cloth at the burn, nor bleachers that night. Also, on the 2nd of August 1704, Lilias declared before witnesses, that Grissel Anderson invited her to her house on that Lammas day, the morning just before the last burning of the witches. Grissel desired her to come and speak with a man there. Accordingly she went in there about daybreak, where there was a number of witches, some laughing, some standing, others sitting, but she came immediately away, being to go to Lammas fair. And several of them were taken shortly after, and Grissel Anderson among the rest, who was burnt, and some of them taken that very week. She adds, that Euphon Sturt warned her to the meeting at the barn rod. And the said Euphon was burnt afterward, though she had been no longer a witch than a month before her death. She added, that she knew few of them that were at those meetings, especially the young sort, because they were masked like gentlewomen. And if Agnes Curry's heart would fall, she could tell as much as any, being in the midst of the meeting, where she saw her face by the Blue Low near Patrick Sands. At Torryburn, August 19, 1704. After prayer, sederant, and minister and elders. Elspeth Williamson declared, that shortly after the last communion, there came a woman to her door, and bade her go east the way, whom she followed the length of the churchyard, and leaned upon the dyke, and saw a bourrick of women. Some with black heads, were sitting where the tent stood. The woman that called her, went straight to the meeting, and fell down upon her knees, whereat she wondered, and hearkened if there was any reading or singing of psalms among them, and when she heard none, she thought she was in the wrong place. And did not think the woman would have taken her to the devil's meeting. She thought the woman was Mary Wilson, but is not certain. And about 10 at night, some time after, a young lass came to her door, and desired her to go westward a little, whom she followed, but knew not the lass, she went so fast west the town before her. And was got the length of the Gaulet or she came to the west end of the town. And when she was come west near the Gaulet, she saw a meeting of women and some men, and she stood at a little distance from them, and saw them go through other for the space of near an hour, and removed insensibly eastward from her. Upon which she stole away. Lilias Audi confessed, that after she entered into compact with Satan, he appeared to her some hundred of times, and that the devil himself summoned her to that meeting which was on the glebe, he coming into her house like a shadow, and went away like a shadow. And added, that she saw Elspeth Williamson and Agnes Curry both there, only Agnes was nearer the meeting than Elspeth, who was leaning on the churchyard dyke with her elbow. She added, that the devil bade her attend many meetings that she could not attend, for age and sickness, and though he appeared not to her when there was company with her, yet he appeared to her like a shadow, so that none could see him but herself. At another time, she said, that when she renounced her baptism, the devil first spoke the words, and she repeated them after him, and that as he went away she did not hear his feet on the stubble. August 20th, 1704. After prayer, Sedurant, minister, and elders. It is to be minded, that Lilias Audi appeared before the congregation on the Lord's day, and being called up by the minister and asked if she was guilty of witchcraft, she confessed freely that she was. And had entered expressly into covenant with Satan, and renounced her baptism, the devil putting one hand on the crown of her head, and the other under the soles of her feet, and she gave over all to the devil that was betwixt his two hands. And she was come hither to confess her sins, and to get her renounced baptism back again. She also desired all that had power with God to pray for her, to this the minister and elders, and whole congregation, were witnesses. It being reported, that Agnes Curry should have delayed Bessie Callender and Mary Wilson, guilty of witchcraft. Agnes being called, compeered and declared, that Robert Curry told her Elspeth Williamson told him that Bessie Callender and Mary Wilson, were witches. George Stewart, solemnly sworn, purged of malice and partial counsel, aged 27 years, married, deponed, that Agnes Curry said to him, I'll tell you, but you must not let any of your folk know of it. He replied, I believe in Christ, I hope the devil hath no power over me. Ha, ha, said she, the devil hath done wrong to many, and he may wrong your friends or goods. Elspeth Williamson told Robert Curry, and Robert Curry told me, that Bessie Callender and Mary Wilson, are guilty of witchcraft. And this is truth, as he shall answer. Causa scientia. Sic subscribitor, G.S. James Peyton, solemnly sworn, purged of malice and partial counsel, aged between 22 and 23 years, depones, he was not requiring anything of her by way of confession of persons' names to which she assented in the meantime. But Agnes Curry said to him, there are 2 witches in New Milne, and one of them is at the bridge end. Upon which I replied, you must tell me, for I have a sister there. Agnes replied, her name begins with A.B., George Marshall replied, is that our Bessie? She answered, you are right enough, it's Bessie Callender. As to the other person, she would not tell her name at first, but said, she is B. East your house, but after owned the person to be Mary Wilson, but desired him not to divulge it to your mother or sister, lest these persons do you ill. This is the truth, as he shall answer. Causa scientia. Sic subscribitor, J. Peyton. George Marshall, sworn, purged, and Ut supra, aged 39 years, married, declared, Ut supra, and added, that she said, ye are husbandmen, divulge it not, lest your beasts get rang, and said to Alexander Drysdale, you go to sea, you have need to take head. And she said, the other lived B. East James Peyton's house, but he going away, heard not her name. And this is the truth, as he shall answer. Causa scientia. Sic subscribitor, G.M. Agnes Curry assented to this in session. And that Robert Curry told her, that Elspeth Williamson told him these things, and that Mary Carmichael in Linlithgow, is a witch. Robert Curry called, compeered, and declared that Elspeth Williamson delayed to him Bessie Callender, Mary Wilson, and Mary Carmichael, as witches, which the said Elspeth referred to the probation of the witch. The foresaid day, Lilias Audi said to the minister, that the devil was angry that she went to church, and said, that she might do as well at home. Being interrogate if he was angry like, she said, that he never looked pleasant like. And closed with prayer. August 29th, 1704. Lilias Audi declared, some hours before her death, in audience of the minister, precentor, George Pringle, and John Patterson, that what she had said of Elspeth Williamson and Agnes Curry, was as true as the gospel. And added, it is as true as the sun shines on that floor, and dim as my eyes are, I see that. It being reported that William Wilson knew something of Agnes Curry that was witchcraft, as also Janet Glass, they were called, and the said William declared, that about 24 years ago. Helen Johnston having overlaid her child the night after it was baptized, and the next day he was lamenting the woman's case, Agnes Curry said to him, if I had been her comer, I could have advised her to take heed to her child. And also, that the said William was desired some time ago to bring some slike 15 to a house that belonged to Agnes, and he answered, that his mare was in the yoke all day and could not. Agnes said she could not help it, and that same day his mare died in a stank. Janet Glass declared, that she came once into Agnes Curry's house, having something to do with Agnes, who in the time was baking bread, and broke 3 several bannocks, lying in 3 several places, and gave it to the said Janet. And she with eating the same fell in a fever. Torryburn, 3d of September, 1704. After prayer, sederant, minister and elders, except Robert Baxter, John Weir and John Wardlaw. Agnes Curry being called, compeered, and confronted with Janet Glass. Janet declared, that about 12 years ago, she brought her cloth to her house, and Agnes was baking bread, and she broke 3 several bannocks that were in 3 several places, and gave her a piece of every bannock. And immediately she took the fever. And she adds, that she gave her a little piece of every bannock, and it was all one sort of bread. Janet declares that she is ready to swear it, also adds, Helen Lawson was so used. Helen Lawson being called, declared, that a long time ago, Agnes Curry broke 3 several bannocks, and gave her a piece of every one, but she would not take the 3rd piece, and adds, that she is ready to swear it. Elspeth Williamson being brought in, and interrogate if she was a witch, she answered, that she would not deny that. N.B. Lilia's 80 was buried within the Seamark at Torryburn. 16. William Coase being called, compeered, and owned, that on Sabbath morning, anno 1704, it being moonlight, he saw Bessie Michaeljohn, or the devil in her stead, in James Chalmers's bark, then lying in Leith, and he doubts not but she saw him. And adds, that she had a green plaid about her head, as he offered to depone. The session considering that the devil appeared in her likeness, it was no proof against her, they judged it not necessary to regard that matter, and thought William Coase should not be troubled, it appearing he had not spoken it from malice. Nor accused her of witchcraft formerly. March 30th, 1709. Margaret Humble called, declared, that Helen Key said, that when she heard Mr. Logan 17 speak against the witches, she thought that he was daft, and she had up her stool to go out of the kirk, also declared that Helen Key threatened to strike Mary Nielsen. Jean Pearson declared, that she heard Helen Key say, that she would strike Mary Nielsen. The said Helen Key confessed what all the witnesses declared. As to the affair of Helen Key, Mary Nielsen called, declared, that she heard Helen Key say, that she thought Mr. Logan was not wise when he was speaking against the witches. And she had one unseemly expression that is not decent to be put on the records, and when Margaret Humble rebuked her, she answered, it was not Margaret Humble's part to speak in Mr. Logan's favours, but she would not express what Mr. Logan said of Margaret Humble to her. The session having found her convicted of profane irreverent language against the minister and his doctrine, without any shadow of provocation, and of gross lying and prevaricating, both in private and before the session. And of threatening to strike a person because she had reported her impudent, godless, and scandalous language, therefore, they appoint her to sit before the congregation the next Lord's Day, and to be rebuked after the afternoon sermon. The end. Delta Epsilon Tau Tau Epsilon Rho Omicron Sigma Kappa Omicron Pi Iota Alpha, or a brief discourse concerning the second sight. Commonly so called. By the Reverend Mr. John Fraser, deceased, late minister of Terry and Call, and Dean of the Isles. And published by Mr. Andrew Simpson, with a short account of the author. Edinburgh. Printed by Mr. Andrew Simpson, Anno Domini. Nkvii. To the Right Honourable. Universally learned, and my very singular good. Lord George, Earl of Cromarty, Viscount. Of Tarbat, Lord MacLeod and Castlehaven. And Lord Justice General of the Kingdom of Scotland, and one of her Majesty's most honourable Privy Council. This following discourse, intituled Delta Tau Epsilon Rho Omicron Sigma Kappa Omicron Pi Iota Alpha, and written by the Reverend Mr. John Fraser, late Minister of Terry and Call, and Dean of the Isles, is, with all due respect and reverence, dedicated by the printer and publisher hereof. His Lordship's most humble. An obedient servant in all duty. Andrew Simpson. The publisher to the reader. The reverend author of the ensuing discourse having married my near kinswoman, and being in this city in November 1700, in order to the settling of some of his affairs. As we were discoursing of several things relating to the Highlands and Western Isles of Scotland, we came to speak of the second sight, reported to be so common in these parts. He told me, that as to the thing itself, it was most certain and undeniable, and that he could give many instances of it, as also, that he had written a short discourse upon that subject. This he promised to transmit to me. Accordingly, on his return home, after a tedious and troublesome voyage, both by sea and land, he sent me that discourse, written with his own hand, desiring me to publish the same after some of his friends here had perused it, which being done, I, at my own conveniency, put it to the press, but before it was finished, I received an account that the author was dead, whereupon I forbore the publishing of it, till I should get an account of several passages concerning himself and family. Designing to prefix the same to the discourse itself, which I conceived would be acceptable to his friends, and not displeasing to the reader. And therefore I dispatched a letter to one of his nearest relations, and that was best acquainted with him, and with the passages of his life, that so I might thereby be the better informed. In answer whereunto, I received a paper containing several memoirs, from which I have collected the following account. Mr. John Fraser, the author of this discourse, was born in the Isle of Mull, in the year of our Lord 1647. His father, Mr. Furchard Fraser, was born in the north of Scotland, near Strathrick, about the year 1606, and lineally descended of the family of my Lord Lovat, but mediately of the family of Tober, one of the lairds of the name of Fraser. After he had taken his degrees at the university, and applied himself to the study of divinity, he was called by the Bishop of the Isles, there being then few learned men able to preach in the Irish tongue, to be minister of the Isles of Terry and Call, to which charge the deanery of the Isles was annexed. He was the first master of arts that preached constantly there as minister of the parish, there being then there one Ewan Lean, who was appointed to catechize and convene the people, there being few or none, as said is, able to serve the cure. But being there, he was very diligent in his ministerial function in teaching and instructing them, leaving them far better than he found them. For at his first coming, there were but 3 heritable gentlemen of the name of Menie that could subscribe their own names, the time Mr. Furchard Fraser served as minister of the Isles of Terry and Call, which were conjoined in one parish. May be collected from his epitaph, written by his son, our author, which is Epitaphium Magistri for Chardy Fraser Decani Insularum. Ca obiit 14 die Februarii Anno Domini 1680. Itatis 74. Provigil eti blandis, mitis, gravis ac. Benignus. Doctus eti eloquiae deteritate fluens. Pavicovs Christi pandens mysteria verbi. Exemplum vitae prebit ipsi gregi. Lux furat populi lustris bis quinque. Paractis. Sacerdocens, sancto munera functus obit. Hic requiem tumulo corpus capit, ind regressus. Spiritus ad dominum, cadetit ante, volat. Mr. Johannes Fraserus, Decanus Insularum. His mother's name was Janet Menie, daughter to Lochlon Menie of Call, an ancient family of that name and clan. His father, as he was careful to instruct others, so he did not neglect his son, our author, but having fitted him for the university, he sent him to the College of Glasgow, and committed him to the care of Mr. William Blair, one of the regents there, who advanced him to the degree of Master of Arts, between the 24th and 25th year of his age. From thence he went to the Isle of Mull, and was chaplain to Sir Alan Lean of Duart. Thereafter, viz. March 4, 1677, he was married to Mary Simpson, the only surviving daughter of Mr. Matthias Simpson, sometime minister of Stirling, who died November 1664. 2 or 3 years before his father's death, being canonically ordained presbyter, he was admitted to his father's charge, in regard his father, partly by age, and partly by sickness, was rendered very unfit to serve the cure of these 2 islands, Terry and Call, as also of Icolmkiln, which was also annexed to it, and at a greater distance. However, such was his care and diligence in the work of the ministry, that, by the blessing of God upon his endeavours, he converted to the true Protestant faith 24 families in the Isle of Call, the laird himself being then ringleader. That were deluded by Father O'Donnell and others, his father not being able to oversee his flock, by reason of his foresaid condition. His father dying in the year 1680, he served the cure thereafter, by constant and diligent preaching, baptizing, marrying, visiting the sick, and exercising all other duties incumbent on him. But at length, because his principles would not allow all the demands of the Synod of Argyll, his charge was declared vacant, and his stipend taken from him. Notwithstanding whereof, there being no minister sent to oversee these islands, he went about the exercise of his ministry as formerly, being supplied by the charity and benevolence of his parishioners, who had an entire kindness for him. But his stipend, as said is, was taken from him and bestowed some other way. And thus he continued till about a month before his death, which was on the 25th day of August 1702, in which he changed this troublesome life for a better, leaving behind him a desolate poor widow, with several children, both sons and daughters. As also a sorrowful people, who were now wholly deprived of a spiritual pastor, and of such a one as was every way qualified for that charge. For he was not only a good and learned man, but was master of their language, being born and bred up in the Isles, understood their humours, conditions, and manners of life, and being a wise and sagacious person, complaisant, and of a winning deportment. All which good qualifications he was endowed with, as all which were acquainted with him, can sufficiently testify. As for the subject of the following discourse, commonly called the second sight, though I think it might be more fitly called the first sight, because it for the most part sees things before they are. I shall not undertake to defend all the notions that he has of it, and whether they will agree with true philosophy, but shall refer that to others of a higher reach and deeper understanding than I ever durst pretend to. But this I will say in his defence, that, considering the place where it was written, even among the remote isles, verve cum in patria, where he wanted the converse of learned men, and the benefit of books. Two necessary qualifications for one that writes on such an abstruse subject. I humbly conceive, that the great clerks of this age, who have the benefit of books and converse, should not superciliously undervalue him that wants them. However, although I shall not pretend to maintain all that he writes, as to the causes, and of this second sight, nor do I believe all the stories that I have heard concerning it, yet the thing itself, or that there is such a thing as is commonly called the second sight, I do firmly believe. Being induced thereto by the relations that I have received from persons of known integrity, and such as I suppose are wiser than to be imposed upon, and honester than to impose fables instead of truths, upon others. Among the relations that I have been told concerning this subject, I shall only single out one or two, and then I shall conclude. A noble peer of this nation being one morning in his bedchamber, and attended by several persons, when his servant had put a new coat upon his lord, a gentleman standing by, presently cried out, "For God's sake, my lord, put off that coat." And being asked the reason, he replied, that he saw a whinger or poignard, stick in the breast of it. The noble peer esteeming this as a mere fancy, replied, "This coat is honestly come by, and I see no reason why I may not wear it." The gentleman still entreated, and earnestly craved, that it might be put off, upon which debate, the noble peer's lady being not far off, came in, and being informed of the whole affair, entreated her lord to comply with the gentleman's desire. Which he did. Meantime one of the servants standing by, desired the lady to give it him, and he would wear it. She granted his request, who put it on, and ere night he was stabbed by a poniard, in that very place which the gentleman had pointed to in the morning. This relation I had from a very ingenious and understanding gentleman, who was grandchild to the said noble peer. I shall add another strange story, which I had from a reverend minister of the gospel, and my intimate acquaintance. 'Tis thus, in the year 1665, Alexander Wood, eldest son to the Laird of Nether Ben Home, in Angus, having ended his prenticeship with a merchant in Edinburgh, told Mr. James Walker, that, in the year 1662 or 1663, he had been employed by his master to go to the Lewis to make up herring. And being there, and having a good tack of herring, their salt and casks were all made use of, and then they being idle, he began to fret that his master had delayed so long to supply them. And being one day drinking in a country house, and complaining, he went to the door of the house, and there followed him a country man, who said to him, If you will give me a small hire, I'll tell you what is become of the ship you are looking for. And without more ado, he set his foot upon the gentleman's foot, in which time he saw the ship in a great storm, ready to perish, and the seamen casting out their lading to lighten the ship. But when the countryman's foot was off his he saw nothing. The ship at that time was about 100 miles from them, and about 48 hours thereafter, she came into the same harbor, and had been in the same condition he saw her in at that time the countryman's foot was on his foot. It would be tedious to add any more stories that I have had from persons of undoubted veracity, and therefore, reader, I shall only subscribe myself. Your humble servant in all duty. Andrew Simpson. A short advertisement to the reader. Courteous reader. You may be surprised to meet with such an abstruse theme, handled in specie by few or none, from the pen of a person in my circumstances, lying at a great distance from the universities and centre of the kingdom. And consequently may be justly supposed to want that ordinary help of books and conference with the learned, that others may enjoy. In the first place, believe that I am so far from affecting vain singularity, a hateful vice in the schools as well as the pulpit, that nothing of that kind moved me to treat of the subject of the following discourses. But for my own satisfaction I drew up the following heads, and did not resolve at the first to expose them to public view, justly fearing the censure of presumption. But I was, by the persuasion of some serious friends, prevailed with to commit myself to the favourable judgment of the learned, who might sooner commend my endeavours than censure my failings, rather than suppress such a fine subject, which probably might be more fully and largely treated of by others after the perusal of this discourse. Take this pamphlet then in the rude dress that I could give. At least it may excite thy thoughts, if not to approve of what is here deduced, yet to propone of thine own a more satisfying method of explaining this remarkable phenomenon, which is the genuine design and wish of, Sir, your humble servant. The author. Delta Epsilon Tau Tau Epsilon Rho Omicron Sigma Kappa Omicron Pi Iota Alpha, or, A Brief Discourse Concerning the Second Sight. Commonly so called. Many have undertaken to treat of the nature and operation of spirits, as also of the various manners of divination among the Gentiles, and but too much used among Christians, likewise of the perturbation and deception of the fancy, caused by melancholy. And very many speak in ordinary discourses of this called the second sight, and the consequences of it, but none that I know handle it in titulo. That such representations are made to the eyes of men and women, is to me out of all doubt, and that effects follow answerable thereto, as little questionable. But I have found so many doubt the matter of fact, which I take to be the reason that so little has been written of it, that I think it necessary to say something briefly, that may put the existency of it beyond all scruple. If I should insert all the clear instances that I have had of this matter, it would be tedious and unnecessary, therefore I will content myself, and I hope will satisfy the reader, with 4 or 5 instances, as follows. The first instance is by a servant of my own, who had the trust of my barn, and nightly lay in the same. One day he told me he would not any longer lie there, because nightly he had seen a dead core in his winding sheets straight beside him, particularly at the south side of the barn. About an half year thereafter, a young man that had formerly been my servant, fell dangerously sick, and expecting death, would needs be carried near my house. And shortly thereafter he died, and was laid up a night before he was buried in the same individual barn and place that was foretold. And immediately the servant that foretold this came to me and minded me of the prediction, which was clearly out of my mind till he spoke of it. The second instance is after this manner. I was resolved to pay a visit to an English gentleman, Sir William Sacheverell, who had a commission from the English Court of Admiralty, to give his best trial to find out gold or money, or any other thing of note, in one of the ships of the Spanish Armada, that was blown up in the Bay of Tobermory, in the Sound of Mull. And having condescended upon the number of men that were to go with me, one of the number was a handsome boy that waited upon my own person. And, about an hour before I made sail, a woman, that was also one of my own servants, spoke to one of the seamen, and bade him dissuade me to take that boy along with me, or if I did, I should not bring him back alive. The seaman answered, he had not confidence to tell me such unwarrantable trifles. I took my voyage, and sailed the length of Tobermory. And having stayed 2 or 3 nights with that liberal and ingenuous gentleman, who himself had collected many observations of the second sight in the Isle of Man, and compared his notes and mine together, I then took leave of him. In the meantime, my boy grew sick of a vehement bloody flux, the winds turned cross, that I could neither sail nor row, the boy died with me the 11th night from his decumbiture, the next morning the wind made fair. And the seaman to whom the matter was foretold, related the whole story when he saw it verified. I carried the boy's corpse aboard with me, and after my arrival, and his burial, I called suddenly for the woman, and asked at her what warrant she had to foretell the boy's death. She said, that she had no other warrant but that she saw, 2 days before I took my voyage, the boy walking with me in the fields, sewed up in his winding sheets from top to toe, and that she had never seen this in others. But she found that they shortly thereafter died. And therefore concluded that he would die too, and that shortly. The third instance was thus. Duncan Campbell, brother German to Archibald Campbell of Invera, a gentleman of singular piety and considerable knowledge, especially in divinity, told me a strange thing of himself. That he was at a time in Kincaid, having then some employment there, and one morning walking in the fields, he saw a dozen of men carrying a bier, and knew them all but one, and when he looked again, all was vanished. The very next day, the same company came the same way, carrying a bier, and he going to meet them, found that they were but 11 in number, and that himself was the 12th, though he did not notice it before. And it is to be observed, that this gentleman never saw anything of this kind before or after, till his dying day. Moreover, that he was of such solid judgment and devout conversation, that his report deserves an unquestionable credit. The fourth instance I had, to my great grief, from one John Donald, a servant of Loch Lon of Call, who was then newly returned from Holland, having the charge of a captain. This gentleman came one afternoon abroad to his pastime in the fields, and this John Donald meets him, and saw his clothes shining like the skins of fishes, and his periwig all wet, though indeed the day was very fair. Whereupon he told privately, even then, to one of Call's gentlemen, that he feared he should be drowned. This gentleman was Charles Menie, who gave me account of it. The event followed about a year thereafter, for the Laird of Call was drowned in the water of Lochie in La Harbour. I examined both Charles Menie and John Donald, and found, that the prediction was as he told me. And the said Donald could produce no other warrant, than that he found such signs frequently before to forego the like events. This man indeed was known to have many visions of this kind, but he was none of the strictest life. The fifth instance is strange, and yet of certain truth, and known to the whole inhabitants of the island of Ig, lying in the latitude of 56 degrees 20 minutes, and longitude 14 degrees. There was a tenant in this island, a native, that was a follower of the captain of Clanranald, that lived in a town called Kildonan, the year of God 85, who told publicly to the whole inhabitants, upon the Lord's Day, after divine service, performed by Father Oran, then priest of that place, that they should all flit out of that isle, and plant themselves somewhere else. Because that people of strange and different habits and arms were to come to the isle, and to use all acts of hostility, as killing, burning, turling, and deforcing of women, finally, to discharge all that the hands of an enemy could do. But what they were, or whence they came, he could not tell. At the first there was no regard had to his words, but frequently thereafter, he begged of them to notice what he said, otherwise they should repent it, when they could not help it. Which took such an impression upon some of his near acquaintance, as that several of them transported themselves and their families, even then, some to the Isle of Canny, some to the Isle of Rum. 14 days before the enemy came thither, under the command of one Major Ferguson and Captain Pottinger, whilst there was no word of their coming, or any fear of them conceived. In the month of June 1689, this man fell sick, and Father Oren came to see him, in order to give him the benefit of absolution and extreme unction, attended with several inhabitants of the isle, who, in the first place, narrowly questioned him before his friends, and begged of him to recant his former folly and his vain prediction. To whom he answered, that they should find very shortly the truth of what he had spoken, and so he died. And within 14 or 15 days thereafter, I was eyewitness, being then prisoner with Captain Pottinger, to the truth of what he did foretell. And being beforehand well instructed of all that he said, I did admire to see it particularly verified, especially that of the different habits and arms, some being clad with red coats, some with white coats and grenadier caps, some armed with sword and pike, and some with sword and musket. Though I could give many more proofs, as unquestionable as these, yet I think what is said, is sufficient to prove the being of such a thing as the same in hand. And I cannot but wonder, that men of knowledge and experience should be so shy to believe that there may be visions of this kind administered by good or bad angels. There being nothing more certain, than that good angels suggested visions to the prophets of the Lord, before the coming of Christ in the flesh, and particularly to the Apostle St. John, after the ascension of our Lord. Likewise that evil angels presented visions, as well as audible voices, to the 450 false prophets of Ahab, the 400 prophets of the groves, is as little to be doubted. It being as easy, if not easier, to work upon the sight, as well as upon the hearing. We know but too well, that necromancers and magicians themselves, have not only seen the shapes and forms of things, but likewise have allowed others to see the same, who had no skill of their art. A precedent for which, is the Witch of Endor. I remember, about 23 years ago, there was an old woman in my parish, in the Isle of Terry, whom I heard was accustomed to give responses, and likewise averred, that she had died and been in heaven, but allowed to come back again. And because she could not come to church, I was at the pains to give her a visit, attended with 2 or 3 of the most intelligent of my parish. I questioned her first whether she said she was in heaven. And she freely confessed she was, and that she had seen Jesus Christ, but not God the Father, or the Holy Ghost, that she was kindly entertained with meat and drink, and that she had seen her daughter there, who died about a year before. That her daughter told her, though she was allowed to go there, that she behoved to come back and serve out her apprenticeship on earth, but would shortly be called for, and remain there forever. She could very hardly be put out of this opinion, till I inquired more narrowly of her children, if she fell at any time in a syncope, which they told me she did, and continued for a whole night, so that they thought that she was truly dead. And this is the time she alleged she was in heaven. The devil took an advantage in the ecstasy to present to her fancy a map of heaven, as if it had been a rich earthly kingdom, abounding with meat, drink, gold, and silver. By the blessing of God, I prevailed with her to be persuaded that this was but a vision presented to her fancy by the devil, the father of lies. And that she might deprehend the falsehood of it from this one head, that she imagined her body was there, as well as her soul, and that she did eat and drink, and was warmed, while, as her own children, and the neighbors that watched her, did see, and did handle her body several times that night, so that it could not be with her in heaven. I did further examine her what warrant she had for the responses she gave, which were found very often true, even in future contingent events. She freely confessed, that her father upon his deathbed, taught her a charm, compiled of barbarous words, and some unintelligible terms, which had the virtue, when repeated, to present, some few hours after the proposition of a question, the answer of the same in live images before her eyes, or upon the wall. But the images were not tractable, which she found by putting to her hand, but could find nothing. I do not think fit to insert the charm, knowing that severals might be inclined to make an unwarrantable trial of it. This poor woman was got reclaimed, and was taught fully the danger and vanity of her practice, and died peaceably about a year after, in extreme old age. I know assuredly, that Janet Douglas, that was first at Dumby, yet spoke thereafter, who had given many responses by signs and words, and foretold many future events, being examined by Mr. Gray, one of the ministers of the city of Glasgow, denied any explicit or implicit pact ion, and declared freely, that the answers of the questions proposed to her were represented by a vision in lively images, representing the persons concerned, and acting the thing, before her eyes. This Mr. Gray exchanged several discourses in right with Sir James Turner, concerning her. By this time, you may see that this theme deserves the consideration of the learned, first, to inquire how much of this may come from a natural constitution and temperament, when confounded with a flatuous or melancholic distemper. And what influence an external agent, namely, an angel, good or bad, may have upon the organ of the eye and the fancy, and how far the medium between the organ of the eye and an object visible, may be disposed for their purpose, namely, the air and light. And what connection may be found betwixt the representations made to the eye or fancy, and the future contingent events that experience teaches do follow thereupon, as for example, a man is seen bleeding, or sewed up in his winding sheets, who is shortly to be wounded, or assuredly to die. As for the first, all the learned physicians of the world know too well by experience what great labor they have to cure the deceptions of the fancy, especially in hypochondriac diseases. Nay, patients cannot be persuaded but they see men, women, fowls, and four-footed beasts, walking abroad or in their chambers. Seldom it is, that a man passes any great and turbulent fever, without the trouble of some such representations. It is memorable, that a gentleman, that had been a great proficient in physic himself, imagined at length that there was a quick frog in his belly. And after he had travelled over a good part of Italy, and consulted with the doctors of Padua, yet could not be cured, or dissuaded. He came at length to the learned physician Platerus, in Basil, who told him, that a frog by certain experience is known not to live above 3 years, so that his distemper continuing longer than 3 years, could not be caused by the frog. That could not live so long. Moreover, that his stomach would strangle the frog, and that the frog could not live any considerable time out of its own element, the water. So that the properest and most specific medicines being made use of, it were a shame for him to be so obstinate. At last he was persuaded, and his fancy satisfied. This story is no less renowned of what befell Andreas Osiander, a man learned in most languages. When he was a young man, and being troubled with a quartan ague, a little before the fit he could not be persuaded that he was in the house at all, but that he was in a wood, and much molested with wild beasts and serpents of all kinds. Neither could he be prevailed with that this was false, till Facius Cardanus was called for to him, who cured him for the time, so that he knew his friends that were sitting beside him, and the chamber to be his own chamber. But after Facius had left him, he was troubled with the same opinion and distemper, even till the ague had quieted him. I have myself seen a neighbor of my own, and my parishioner too, John Fale, that lived to the age of 80 years, a man that was truly very sagacious by nature. And though his sight was much decayed, the seat of his judgment was nothing touched, and as he grew weaker, merely by old age, without any remarkable distemper, I made frequent visits to him. One day as I was coming away from him, he told me he had something of consequence to ask of me, and desired all to remove except his wife and another gentleman, that was a friend of his. This done, sir, says he, I desire to know by what warrant or commission so many of my friends, that are dead long ago, are allowed to come and discourse with me, and drink before me, and yet are not so civil as give me a tasting of it. I told him, that it was only the trouble of his fancy, and his frequent thinking of the world to come and his friends that were gone before him. And he replied to me very smartly, Sir, says he, I perceive it is the work of the fancy, for since I cannot see yourself, for only by your voice I know you, how could I see them? It was strange that he saw them the very mean time that others were in the house with him, and asked several questions at them, but got no answer. And, for all this, the seat of his wit was as entire as ever. Moreover, this trouble left him a little before he died. Many such illusions are reported of eremites, caused merely by the confusion of the brains, bred by their fasting and unwholesome food, which I shall not trouble the reader with. If you will ask how cometh this to pass, take notice of the following method, which I humbly offer to your consideration. Advert, in the first place, that visible ideas, or species, are emitted from every visible object to the organ of the eye. Representing the figure and color of the object, and bearing along with it the proportion of the distance, for sure the objects enter not the eye, nor the interjacent distant tract of ground. And a third thing different from the eye and the object, and the distant ground, must inform the eye. These species are conveyed to the brain by the optic nerve, and are laid up in the magazine of the memory, otherwise we should not remember the object any longer than it is in our presence. And a remembering of these objects is nothing else but the fancy's reviewing, or more properly the soul of man, by the fancy reviewing of these intentional species formerly received from the visible object unto the organ of the eye, and reconducted unto the seat of the memory. Now, when the brain is in a serene temper, these species are in their integrity, and keep their rank and file as they were received. But when the brain is filled with gross and flatuous vapors, and the spirits and humor enraged, these ideas are sometimes multiplied as an army, by mist. Sometimes magnified, sometimes misplaced, sometimes confounded by other species of different objects, perhaps by half and half, so that the fancy has two for one, one bigger than two of itself, and sometimes the half of one and the half of another, represented in one. And this deception is not only incident to the fancy, but even to the external senses, particularly the seeing and hearing. For the vices, or seeing, is nothing else but the transition of the intentional species through the crystalline humor to the retiform coat of the eye, and judged by the common sense, and conveyed by the optic nerve to the fancy. Of this we have a clear demonstration from the representation of external objects through a crystal and glass, upon any lucid, smooth, and solid reflectant, placed before the glass in a dark chamber, which is one of the noblest experiments in the whole optics. Now, if these species formerly received and laid up in the brain, will be reversed back from the same to the retiform coat and crystalline humor as formerly. These is in effect a lively seeing and perception of the object represented by these species, as if, de novo, the object had been placed before the eye. For the organ of the eye had no more of it before, than now it has. Just so with the hearing, it is nothing else but the receiving of the audible species to that part of the ear that is accommodated for hearing, so that when the species are retracted from the brain to their proper organs, for example, the ear and the eye, hearing and seeing are perfected, as if the objects had been present to influence the organs de novo. And it is not to be thought that this is a singular opinion, for Cardanus, an eminent author of great and universal learning and experience, maintains this reversion of the species, and attributes his own vision of trees, wild beasts, men, cities, and instructed battles, musical and martial instruments, from the 4th to the 7th year of his age, to the species of the objects he had seen formerly, now retracted to the organ of the eye, and cites Averroes, an author of greater renown for the same opinion. See Cardanus de subtilitate rerum pagina 311. And it seems truly to be founded upon relevant grounds. I have observed a sick person, that complained of great pain and molestation in his head, and particularly of piping and sweating in his ears, which seems to have been caused by the species of piping and singing which he had formerly heard, but were now, through the plethory of his head, forced out of the brain to the organ of the ear, through the same nerves by which they were received formerly. And why may not the same befall the visible species as well as the audible? Which seems to be confirmed by the optic experiment. Take a sheet of painted paper and fix it in your window, looking steadfastly to it for a considerable time, for example, some few minutes, then close your eyes very straight, and place a sheet of clean paper before your eyes. And open your eyes suddenly, you will see the painting almost as lively as they were in the painted sheet with the lively colors. This compression of the eyes by consent, causes a compression of the whole brain, which forces back the visible species of the painted sheet to the organ of the eye, through the optic nerve, which will presently vanish, if the reflectant did not help to preserve them. You may see then how much of these representations may be within ourselves, abstracting from any external agent or object without the eye, to influence the same. The second thing that comes under consideration is, the influence and operation of external agents, namely, an angel, good or bad. It is not to be denied, but good angels may help and dispose all our faculties, excite, elevate, and set them upon edge and action. Likewise, that evil angels may perturb, confound, and hurt, our external and internal senses, when permitted, particularly by stirring the spirits, humors, and vapors, which of themselves, when so stirred, help to make many shapes and representations, either regular or irregular, as has been formerly observed, and withal, they can colorate external objects far beyond any painter, insensibly to the beholder, repent applicando activa passivis. And that they can alter the medium interposed between our senses and the objects, by making it grosser or thinner, opaque or lucid, is a thing not to be questioned. For a clear proof of this I hope any rational man will allow me. That even the evil angels, who were created in a degree above us, must have a more penetrating wit than ours is, and having experienced from their creation, to this very day, and can be present to every experiment found out, or that is committed to writing by the art of man. And withal, being not subject to oblivion as man is, for they have no material faculty to be obliterated, I say any rational man will allow me, that they can do as much, and beyond what the art of man is able to do. But so it is, that painters can make one object more pleasant than another, distorted and worse favored than another, that any smoke may engross the air, that a cloud removed on or off the face of the sun give way to the beams of it to illuminate the air, or to eclipse its light, that vapors and exhalations, from sea and land, multiply and magnify objects, misshapes and distorts them, and makes them of diverse figures, all in an instant. Which is observable in hot summer days, especially in the end of the canicular days, for you may readily see about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. The same hills, providing they are situated at a considerable distance from you, to be of diverse shapes, forms, and figures, changing very suddenly from one shape to another, for example, from a globe to a pyramid, from a pyramid to a quadrangular figure, and all which our ordinary multiplying, magnifying, and distorting glasses, produce. Moreover, that physicians can administer such medicines as may provoke a man to madness and rage, yea, to fantastic or hypochondriac fits. So also medicines that move pleasant and unpleasant dreams, by exciting the melancholic or sanguine humors, raging or peaceable dreams, by moving the choleric or phlegmatic humor. How much more can the prince of the air do, and his retinue, who is better seen in the nature of the elements and their compounds? Who is better seen in the nature of trees, plants, minerals, stones, the secret qualities of springs and fountains, rivers and lochs, and the influence of celestial bodies, and who is better seen in the constitution of every man, his customs and inclinations, and his present state and bygone circumstances? I say, in all these, he is better seen than any man, and can accommodate them to his purpose beyond the greatest virtuoses. Let us therefore consider, that an evil angel being permitted thereunto, can muster in our brain the latent intentional species of external absent objects, and can present the same to the fancy in the methods best fitting his purpose. And not only so in time of our sleep, for then indeed the fancy sticks with more tenacity to what it apprehends, but also when we are not sleeping, he can deduce these species by forcing them out of the rooms or cells of the brain to the organ of the eye and ear, and so of necessity a man either sitting or going in the highway, will hear and see such things as these species do represent. And seeing that naturally it may be done, as would appear from what is above spoken from the strength and force of medicines to operate upon the spirits and humors of man to work strange things, why may not a good or bad angel excite nature to it? Or by an immediate impulse force these material qualities to the organs of the external senses, as well as they can move their vehicles, which are the spirits and humors. The third thing proposed was, the connection of these representations with the future contingent events that are observed to follow them, as for example, a second-sighted man sees a winding sheet upon his neighbor, or blood running down his face, shoulders, or arms, he concludes that he must die, or be wounded in the face, shoulders, or arms. If you will ask what warrant he has for this, he will tell, he has found by experience, that whenever he saw the like of this, that he found death or wounds to follow. Quaeritor, then, what connection can this representation have with an effect or contingent event not yet existent? For answer to this, God, who knoweth all things, no doubt imparteth much of the foreknowledge of things, not only to good angels, but also evil angels, for reasons well known to himself, particularly that they might give some true signs. And so have way to deceive in many things besides. And though the signs foretold should surely come to pass, it does not infer that the doctrine of evil angels, and their lies that they would suggest to mankind, should be credited. This is clear from the 13th of Deuteronomy, 1, 2, and 3, verses, If there arise among you a prophet, or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass whereof he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken to the words of that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God proveth you, to know whether you love the Lord your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul. And this is very just with God when men give themselves over to a reprobate and wicked mind, and evil and unwarrantable practices, expressly against the Lord's commands. I say it is just with God to let evil angels or spirits delude them, and give way to these spirits in order to confirm their lies, to appoint signs beforehand, which signs, by God's appointment, may come to pass, answerable to the prediction. It may rationally, and very probably be concluded, that Ahab's false prophets, in number 400, have often foretold truth. And this purposely by God's appointment, that they might be the better believed, and more easily persuade to lay siege to Ramoth-Gilead. And it is hard to conceive that Ahab should give them so much credit, or they themselves so extraordinary confident, if they had not had many truths suggested to them, and made proof of the same to Ahab. It is not for naught that we are commanded to try the spirits, and that rather by their doctrines, than their signs and wonders, or fair and smooth pretenses. Therefore, suppose these evil angels to know a contingent future event, either by a revelation, or natural or moral causes, they may, in the method foresaid, make the representation of them to the eyes or ears. As for example, an angel, good or bad, finds that either the lungs, heart, stomach, liver, or brain, are under such a consumption, as may against such a time kill a man. Or that he knows the secret contrivance of a potent party that is resolved to wound or kill him, or that it is revealed to him it should be so, which may very well be, as has been above noted, he can easily represent these beforehand. Though the event should follow but a considerable time thereafter. He has no more to do than to reverse the species of these things from a man's brain to the organ of the eye. Here ariseth a question from what has just been said, whether it be more probable that good angels make this representation, because men having this second sight are found to tell truth, and to be innocent in their lives, and free of any pactyon, either implicit or explicit, likewise free of any fraudulent design, and sound enough in the necessary articles of their salvation, or that it be done by evil angels for the trial of men and women, juggling with their fancy and external organs, and so have a patent way to tell lies among some truths. For answer to this question, I shall not be ready positively to determine these things, but I humbly conceive, that as the representations are oft done by evil angels, so likewise it is probable that it may be done by good angels. I cannot be so uncharitable to several men that I have known to be of considerable sense, and pious and good conversation, as to conclude them to be given over to be deluded continually by an evil angel. Moreover, I conceive that there are many good Christians, if they would advert well, that have some secret tokens and signs of notable alterations to come, suggested to them beforehand. And that these signs, some of them are common to them with others, as dreaming, which are often observed to be completely fulfilled, and that some of the signs and warnings are peculiar to some persons, which fail not to answer to the things signified. As for example, I have certainly known a man, that when he found an involuntary motion in such a member of his body, particularly his right hand or right eye, that was sure that some matter of joy would shortly come to his hearing. And that if he found the same motion in the left eye or hand, it signified infallibly grief, and that which is more wonderful, the thing to come signified by these signs and warnings kept in exact proportion with the continuance or vehemency of the motion. If the motion continued long, so did the joy or the grief; if the motion was snell or vehement, so was the matter of grief or joy. And finding that this man was both a good man, and of a right penetrating wit, and had art enough, it moved me to use freedom with several other good men that had knowledge and sense enough to examine circumstances to a hair. I found very many to acknowledge the very same thing, yet signified by different signs, which shows they are not signa naturalia, but ex instituto, which puts me in mind of Dr. Brown's observation to the same purpose. In his inquiry into vulgar errors, where he concludes several presentations to be acted in us by our tutelary angels that have the charge of us at the time. Mark this, though the signs be different in themselves, yet to each particular person, his own sign is still significative of the same thing, and why might not this of the second sight be counted amongst one of these? I likewise humbly conceive, that God might compense the want of many other gifts to poor men, by giving them this minor sort of knowledge. But I would advise all of them that have the second sight, to examine themselves, and to pray earnestly to God that no evil angel should have power to abuse their senses, because the devil still strives to imitate what God, or his good angels, communicates to his own children. I know that the common opinion of some philosophers and divines will be objected, and that is, that angels, good or bad, may condense the air, figurate and colorate the same, and make it of what figure or shape they please. So that this representation is made by external objects in effect emitting visible species to the eye. And consequently, that it is not the reversion of the species formerly received. Though, as I have observed before, that good and bad angels can alter the medium in a strange way, and can work great alteration on the elements and their compounds. I think it very improbable that any created power can bring the air to that solidity, and actually condense it, colorate, and figurate it, as to represent a man by a beast, or Peter by Paul. Especially at such a distance as from one side of a chamber to the other. The miracles done by the magicians of Egypt is their Achillean argument. But in short, I say, that what was done by the magicians of Egypt, has neither been a delusion of the senses, as some would have it, much less that the devil could produce the creatures de novo of condensed air. And that for the following reasons: first, thence it would follow that Moses and Aaron were deluded as well as the Egyptians. But the last is false, therefore the first. Secondly, it would follow, that the fashioning and framing of Adam's body of clay, was but a mean act of creation in comparison of these creatures, if they should be fashioned and framed of condensed air, which is naturally a fluid element, not so easily stigmatized as the earth. I do not deny but the devil can snatch dead and quick bodies from one place to another, and that insensibly to the beholders, by pressing their optic nerves, as Franciscus Valesius has observed in his Sacra Philosophia. And I conclude with Abraham Cooley, no contemptible author, that the magicians of Egypt were after this manner served by the devil, to imitate God's power in the hands of Moses and Aaron. Mark, finally, if it were within the sphere of angelical power to take bodies of condensed air, what needed them assume such material and earthly bodies as these angels that came to Abraham and Lot assumed? Whose bodies could be touched and handled, and whose bodies were not found to yield to the touch, as the most condensed air must do. And it is very consisting with reason, that the angels, good or bad, should rather assume bodies of the element of the earth, which is a great deal more easily brought to the figure and fashion of a body, than the air. Some curious spirits, perhaps, may desire to know whether this second sight be hereditary or propagable from father to son. And I think no wonder that some would think so, because the sanative gift of the king's evil is lineally traduced to the natural heirs of the crown of England. And there is a whole family in Spain, that has a sanative gift of some particular diseases, which gift is propagated from the father to the son. Neither is it diminished or augmented by the morality or immorality of the persons, as has been observed by that famous philosopher and physician, Franciscus Valesius, who lived in that kingdom, and had time and opportunity to examine the truth of this affair. In short, I answer, that it is not propagable from father to son, neither peculiar to any particular family, and as I have observed many honest men, free of all scandal that ever I could learn, to have it. So I have observed many vicious persons to have it who foretold truth oft enough. Perhaps it may be doubted what should make this second sight more frequent here than in the heart of the kingdom. I answer, that it is the lack of observation and inquiry that it should not be found there as well as here. Secundo, that it passes under a great odium and disgrace with the most of men, which causes those that see it, conceal it. Thirdly, I confess that credulity and ignorance give occasion to evil spirits to juggle more frequently, than otherwise they would have done. But sure it is, that men of little learning and education may be recompensed by notable presentations, not so obvious to others of greater parts. I remember of a nobleman in Spain, that was deaf and dumb from his infancy, and yet was taught by a monk to speak, and understand what was spoken to him, only by observing the motion of his lips that spoke to him. Sir Kenelm Digby saw him, as he tells in his treatise of bodies, and the monk that taught him, was a cousin of Franciscus Valesius. This was more than ordinary sagacity and docility, and it is found, that many dumb persons foretell many things beforehand, and it is a hard measure to conclude all to be from evil spirits. In fine, as I noted before, as questionless Satan may, and often does, deceive after this manner, so it is as sure, it may be allowed, that good angels may forewarn this way, as well as by other signs and tokens, as Dr. Brown observes. It is observed, that those who have the second sight, have this representation at any time of the day, but indeed more ordinarily in the morning and evening, and with candle light. The design of these weak conceptions on this sublime theme, is not to impose upon any man, freely leaving every man to follow his own judgment in things that offend not church or state. But that others of greater capacity may be stimulated to prosecute the same in a better method, humbly submitting myself to the judgment of my betters, to whose hands perhaps this pamphlet may come. Finis.